Hello everyone, I'm very glad that you listened to my story. Please give me a follow and like the video if you enjoyed it. Feel free to comment and provide feedback so I can improve the sound quality. Yes, I will now continue the unfinished story. Chapter 47, Alice vs. Brian 1. Souta watched the tournament matches. He evaluated all the combat prowess of the participants based on what they showed in the matches. He also has a guess of Brian's strength. In Brian's match, he showed strength and speed that's not normal for a mage student. The power of his punches was strong and his speed was fast that he overwhelmed his opponents in just 2 minutes. Should he say that Brian gained this power as an adventurer? Just like him, Brian was very proficient in close combat, much stronger than Alice, and he entered here in the institute to learn magic. He also saw a stronger fighter in the shield course. Especially the one that was called Brando. Brando was a tough fighter and his defense was extremely hard to break through. If he wasn't wrong, Brando was the strongest fighter here in the tournament. Of course, if the magic wasn't forbidden here, then Lumilia and Alice would be able to match him. Now that the first round of the tournament was finished, it's time for the second round. They were going to fight those who won their first battle. Alex gave them 5 minutes to prepare before they start the first battle of the second round of the tournament. Zach, the 6th top ranker, turned his head to Rain, the 2nd top ranker, and said, "Now that we have a bit of understanding in their strength, wanna bet to me? As a 2nd rank in the institute you possess great amount of points, am I right?" "I said don't talk to me. You trash." Rain snorted and looked at the participants. "Haha, I still have a lot of points here. What should I do with this?" Zach laughed awkwardly as he looked at the object that was attached on his wrist. The object looked like a wristwatch and this item was a private property of the institute. Their points and information were recorded in this piece of technology. They could also use this item to challenge the other students here to raise their ranks and earn points. The points could be used to redeem spell books and combat arts. The students could also use this to get a teacher to teach them a skill or spell one-on-one. Some of the students used these points to rent a living quarter here in the institute and some used it to use the training ground on their own. There were many uses of points here in this institute. All in all, these points were like the currency of the Ladro Institute. Souta and the others were still new here, so Bargain hasn't prepared the items for their use. Ah, what a wonderful display. Zach heard a feminine voice at his left side, so he turned his head to look. Turning his head, he saw a girl wearing the uniform of the institute. She has long lilac-colored hair that was tied in a ponytail. Her left eye was color blue while the other one was red. She's Yanagi Shina, the rank number 1 across the whole institute. The strongest students here in Ladro Institute. I didn't think that she would come here. Zach muttered in a low voice. He knew that this girl has some screw loose in her head, so he wouldn't bother associating himself to her. He shuddered as he recalled those people that she destroyed. Across the whole institute, she dominated everyone ever since she enrolled here. Even Rain wasn't her match at all. To think that this small tournament would attract her attention. He knew that she didn't even watch the other tournaments that teacher Alex made in the other class, but now, she really come here. I wonder who's the unfortunate person that attracted her attention. The second round of the tournament started. The battle was fierce and intense. It exhausted some of the students that don't have huge stamina. Although some of them won the battle, they couldn't participate in the next round because they don't have much stamina. They don't have enough time to recover their stamina as Alex only gave them 5 minutes. So some of them could only surrender. Every battle the crowd that was watching the tournament grew larger. While the second round was ongoing, Souta noticed that Lumilia woke up. He patted Brian's shoulder and said, "I'm going to check if she's okay." Brian looked at Lumilia and nodded his head. He then closed his eyes to recover some of his stamina. Really good. Souta looked at Brian, who was resting, before he shook his head. He turned his attention to Lumilia and slowly approached her. Alice, who was also recovering her stamina, slightly opened her eyes and glanced at Souta's back. After a few moments, she shook her head and opened her mouth. "I can't, this form of mine is too weak. I can't use my full strength." She looked up at the matches. If she won her next match, then she would face Brian. She glanced at Brian, wondering if she could win against him in her condition. From the matches before, she knew that Brian's physical strength was higher than her and his close combat skills were extremely good, that he could rival Souta. Lumilia slowly opened her eyes. She saw her classmates' worried look. She was wondering what happened and she was about to ask them when she recalled that she fought her male classmate in the tournament. "Are you okay, class rep?" "I'm fine." Lumilia held her head as she sat up and looked around her. It seems that the tournament was still ongoing. She clenched her fist tightly when she recalled her fight. She was knocked down in round 1 and she couldn't even fight back against that man. That's a huge humiliation for her. She's the 3rd daughter of the Asvers family and she must show that she wasn't weak. She wouldn't forget why she enrolled in this institute. "Don't force yourself. One of her female classmates said in a worried tone. Lamilia heard her classmate's words. She shook her head and thanked them. She said that she's fine now and they don't have to worry about her. Yo. You okay? She heard a man's voice beside her ears. She turned her head and saw the man who defeated her before. He was called Souta, if she's not wrong. I am fine. You don't have to worry about me. Lamilia crossed her arms. I'm glad, I just get a little excited earlier because I haven't fought someone for a long time, Souta said to her. Actually, it's only been a few days since he fought the Red Woman. He just got out of hand this time as he wanted to test his power against the students here in Ladro Institute. I see. Lamilia frowned as she looked at him. Little excited? She's thinking if he's a battle maniac or not. Yeah, the attitude he showed in the fight was different for his usual self. Normally, he's just a quiet student that only talked to Brian and Alice. He doesn't have any friends either except for those two. How did she know this? Of course, she's the class representative, so she thought that she needed to observe her class. She at least needed to understand the attitude and personality of her classmates. After the measurement of their mana capacity and their affinities, she focused her attention on these three. Brian, Alice, and Souta, those three friends have potential that surpassed her. She knew about the rules of the institute. The points were the most important things here. And she needed Brian, Alice, and Souta if she wanted to compete with other classes. Next week, their teacher would introduce them the usage of points. She already asked some of the upperclassmen, so she has an idea about it. If a student wants to get a powerful spell or combat arts, they needed points. They could even learn those high-level spells that the principal and Bargain knew. The institute has thousands of spells and combat arts. It's not the most famous institute in the whole kingdom for nothing. What's wrong? Souta's voice snapped her out of her daze. And nothing. She looked up at him and shook her head. Really? Really? Lamilia stood up as she patted her clothes. She turned her attention to her classmates and talked to them. Souta just watched her talk to their other classmates, assuring them that she's fine. Heis. He sighed and put his hands inside his pocket before he looked at the match. He looked at the board and saw that it was nearing the third round and his fight was next. He walked forward and looked at the name of his opponent. From what he remembered, this man wasn't that strong. He could easily handle his opponent. I wonder if I could get some skill points in this quest. It doesn't matter even if I don't get EXP, as long as I get some skill points. Then, it worth it? Chapter 48, Alice vs. Brian 2. Souta rubbed his chin as he pondered which one should he cheer. He looked at Brian and Alice back and forth. What? Alice noticed his gaze. She looked at him with a frown. Souta lifted up his hand and raised a thumb in front of her. He smiled and said, good luck. What? Alice took a step back as she pondered what he was doing. Souta didn't answer her. He just closed his eyes and ignored her presence. He could see it all. The students of Shield class and Mage class. All the strong fighter and weak fighter in the stage. They couldn't completely conceal their power to him. Among all the participants here, only a few people weren't breathing heavily. One of them was him, the other one was the student from Shield class, Brando. The other one was Brian. And lastly, his classmate called Jin. Jin was suspicious as he was hiding his true strength. He finished his fight but surrendered in his second match. He didn't even break a sweat from that. Right now, he was just leisurely watching all the battles in the sidelines. Souta didn't know the reason why Jin's hiding his real strength, but now that he got an idea about it, he will not forget Jin's name and face. Then about Brian and Alice's match. From his perspective, he could see that Alice's breathing was already heavy, clearly different from Brian. Souta opened his mouth and said, you'll be having a hard time. It's better to surrender if you can't handle him. Alice looked at him with a scrutinizing gaze. After a few moments, she opened her mouth and said, what do you mean? Souta shifted his eyes to her and replied, can't you see it? You're already tired from your previous battles, but Brian is different. Although you could put up a fight, you will not win this battle. Alice's eyebrows knitted together from his words. She turned her head to look at Brian. She understood what Souta meant. Well, it's only my opinion. Souta shrugged his shoulder. Brian approached them and asked, what you're talking about? We're discussing how to defeat you. Alice was just asking me for advice. Souta replied. What? Why are you discussing that? Brian said in a loud voice as he looked at Alice and Souta. Of course, we'll discuss it after all, you're pretty strong, Souta said. Hee, well, you can take your time. Brian laughed as he scratched his cheek. Damn. This idiot. He thinks I'm praising him. Souta cursed inside his head. Souta shook his head and asked, you will fight Alice in the next battle? Yeah. Brian nodded and he looked at Alice. He clenched his fist in front of him and said, Let's both do our best. Alice looked at Brian in the eyes before she turned around. Yeah. Souta smiled looking at Alice's back. He guessed Alice wouldn't surrender easily from her reaction. Now they will consume some stamina in this fight. It will be easy for me to win this. The only problem is that Brando. Souta turned his head and looked at the students named Brando. Brando was a 2-meter tall man. He has short brown hair and reptilian eyes. Some part of his body has green scales. From the looks of it, he was probably a halfling of beast kin. He was armed with a 1-meter silver-colored shield with black linings at its side. After a few minutes, Alex called Brian and Alice's name. It's time for their battle. Good luck, Alice. Do your best to tire him. Souta said to Alice. I know. I will knock him down and you're next. Alice replied as she turned her head. Oi Souta. Why are you only cheering for her? Brian complained to him. Huh? It's already clear that she's more tired than you. Souta said. So I'm stronger than her. Brian mumbled. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that her opponent was stronger than you fought in your matches. Souta said as he patted Brian's shoulder. Huh? What's with that? Brian said in a loud voice. Damn. Don't talk, just go. Souta pushed Brian's back. Ah. Brian stumbled forward as Souta pushed him. He looked at his side and saw Alice. Souta looked at the two who were facing each other. Alice was wearing a cold face and Brian have a cheerful smile on his face. Now, I could only hope that they put up a good fight. Souta murmured as a grin appeared on his face. The crowd was excited to watch the battle between Alice and Brian. They saw them defeat their opponents with their strength, but now they will face each other. Even the teachers were eager to watch this battle. After all, they knew that unlike the other students, these two were quite strong in their own ways. Ever since the first battle, this one will be the fiercest, Kanda said while looking at the two. But Brian has the advantage. Bargain said. Yeah, but also Alice. Her weapon is an orange grade, after all. If she could properly utilize its strength, then she have a chance to win this match. Kanda said. Brian was standing 5 meters away from Alice with a smile on his face. He was excited to fight Alice as she was strong. Prepare yourself, Alice. I will not hold back. Brian said with a hint of excitement in his voice. Me too, I will not hold back. Alice nodded. She then took out a small red pipe and it transformed into a spear. It was her orange grade weapon. Brian's was just a blue grade gloves. His gloves were black in color and it has 5 black gems in the back of his palm. Alex looked at the two of them and nodded his head. He opened his mouth and said, 1, 2, 3. Battle start. Brian immediately rushed towards Alice as soon as Alex gave the signal. He pulled back both of his fists and when he arrived in front of her he threw a barrage of punch. Alice took a step back and waved her spear blocking all the punch of Brian. Huff. Alice took a deep breath before she lifted up her feet and launched a kick at Brian's side. Brian crossed his arm beside him and blocked her kick. He opened his palm attempting to grab her feet, but Alice already pulled back her feet. Brian is strong. Among all the students here he's the one that could match up to Souta. Alice thought as she gained some distance. She gripped her spear tightly and executed a combat arts that she hasn't used before. Triple stab. Brian opened his eyes widely. He gritted his teeth and waved his hands quickly to block her attacks. Brian was surprised by the power of her attacks. He could feel a numbing sensation in his hands. He knew that he couldn't afford to block her attack. If that's the case, then he would avoid her spear. Strong. Just like what Souta said. Brian muttered in a low voice. He smiled and once again dashed towards Alice. Alice calmly looked at Brian and when he entered her strike zone she stabbed her spear. Brian ducked to avoid her spear. He then rolled to the side before he threw himself at her. Alice gripped her spear tightly and clashed against Brian. Both of them traded blows against each other. From the looks of it, a person wouldn't think that they were students from mage class. They fought like they were an expert in close-quarter combat. Blow after blow they continued to attack each other. Ah! Alice shouted as she executed repulsion kick. Brian flew 5 meters away before he stabilized himself. He lifted up his head and looked at Alice. Alice also looked at Brian and she moved her spear at her side while her other hand was in front of her. She then placed her pivot foot in front and her expression calmed down. She exuded a fierce aura as she maintained her position. She waited for Brian to attack her. Brian smirked when he saw her like that. He knew that she was preparing to launch a powerful attack. In that case, he will also attack her with his own combat arts. He made a grabbing motion in the air and a flame emerged from his palm. The flame coated his fist. Oi, that's high-level combat arts. Souta was surprised that Brian knew high-level combat arts. Souta only knew 2 combat arts and that's only common arts. To produce flames without using mana. With just this, Souta already guessed that it was a high-level combat art. To create a natural phenomenon without using energy. It can only be achieved by using combat arts. Let's go. Brian said before he charged towards Alice. He clenched his fist which was covered in flames. He then threw it at Alice. Blazing strike. Alice clenched her teeth and executed her own combat arts. Berserk spear. Both of them collided and it shook the ground. Chapter 49, Semi-Finals 1. The ground shook and a gust of wind swept out as Brian's and Alice's attack collided against each other. Smoke and dust shot up and covered the two. The crowd was waiting for the dust to clear up so that they could see the outcome of the match. They patiently waited while looking at the thick smoke. Well, that's not bad. Souta sighed as he shrugged his shoulder. He already knew the outcome of the fight. To think that Alice would put up a fight like that with little words. She exceeded his expectations during this battle. After a few moments, the smoke dissipated and it revealed the two participants. Brian was standing and his fist was covered in blood, and Alice was lying on the ground. Her breath was ragged as she stared at the ceiling of the training ground. Huff. I won. Brian said between his breath. He slowly turned his head and looked at Alex. Alex saw Brian looked at him so he declared that Brian won the battle. I lose. Alice muttered in a low voice. She turned her head and looked at Brian before looking at Souta. She wondered how Brian going to fight Souta in his current condition. Brian was exhausted while Souta was still full of energy. Ever since the first match, Souta hasn't met anyone that could put up a decent fight to him. So it's natural that he still has a lot of energy left. Souta looked at the time and saw that there were still 10 minutes left before Brian's next match. With this time, Brian would recover a bit of his strength. Souta delayed his match and he didn't finish it quickly so that Brian would recover. He needed Brian's strength to probe Brando so that he could widen his understanding of Brando's power. He already concluded that he would fight Brando in the finals. If Brando was stronger than he expected, then the fight would become trouble for him. If not, then he would win the tournament and receive the rewards of the quest. If not for the quest, then he wouldn't even bother himself with this kind of tournament. He wouldn't even receive benefits from winning. He smiled and approached Brian. You're stronger than I expected. See. I told you before that I'm strong. Brian said as he showed his muscles. Souta shook his head and turned to Alice. He extended a hand and said, that was a good fight. Alice looked at him with a dumbfounded expression. She then turned her gaze on his hand. Don't hesitate. Souta said. Yeah, you're strong too, Alice. Brian said at the side. Highs. Alice sighed and took Souta's hand. Thanks. Souta shook his head before he helped her stand up. The three chatted for a while as they went to the corner. Alex looked at the three before he said the next match. It seems that there are quite strong first year in this batch. The tournament continued and it entered the semi-final. Brian won his match and Brando too. These two were going to face each other in the semi-finals. Unexpected things happened. Souta opponent in semis quickly surrendered as soon as the match started. This was outside of his expectations. He planned to delay the battle until the last seconds, but his opponent surrendered without putting a fight. Souta glanced at his opponent as he walked towards Alice and Brian. He will remember his face. Eugen Drone was the name of his opponent. He was also a student of Class 1B. Since both of them were classmates, there were a lot of opportunities to interact. He would know something about him in the future. He shook his head and he was greeted by Brian. Ho ho, you enter the final, Souta. Wait for me and we will fight in the finals. Brian said enthusiastically. You're going to lose in your next match, and that's without a doubt. Souta thought as he looked at Brian. He knew that Brian was exhausted, but Brian was still cheerful despite his condition. Go. Souta pushed Brian's back. Right, I'm gonna win this and show you my power, Brian said as he raised his fist before he went towards the center. Do you think he will win? Alice asked while looking at Brian's figure. Souta glanced at her. He was surprised for a moment that she took the initiative to talk. He shook his head and answered her question. No. He looked at her and saw that she wasn't asking why he thought that Brian wouldn't win, so he added, you can think of this. We're mage and we're forbidden to use our mana in this tournament, so we have a huge disadvantage. Brian couldn't use his mana and he's clearly tired after your battle. If he's going to fight without any of those disadvantages, then he will probably win this fight. Then, why? Alice asked. Why? Souta repeated her. Why are you encouraging him to win even though he won't win this battle? Alice elaborated her question. Why? Souta rubbed his chin and decided to tell her his reason. It's because he will help me grasp the strength of his opponent. With his strength, he still could put up a decent fight. Well, it doesn't matter as I'm going to win in the end. Alice looked at him and saw his carefree expression. She opened her mouth and said, You're pretty confident in your strength. It's not that I'm confident in my strength. It's just that I know clearly how powerful am I. I know my weakness and strength, so I know if I could defeat someone or not. Souta said as shrugged his shoulder. Never mind that, the fight is going to start. Brian was looking at Brando with a serious expression. Even though he said that he was going to win this fight, he still knew that his opponent this time was strong, unlike his previous opponents. Brando was a tall man with a large build. He has short messy brown hair and blue eyes. Some parts of his body have green scales indicating that he was a half-beast. He was armed with a meter silver-colored shield. Just like Brian's gloves, his shield was also blue-grade. Brando smiled and said, I saw your fight before. I will say that you're strong and it's making me eager to fight you. Me too, Brian said with a smirk. He then clenched his fists tightly. Both of them waited for Alex to start the match. 1, 2, 3, go. Brian disappeared from his position and instantly appeared in front of Brando. He pulled back his fist and threw it towards Brando. Ah! Brando was surprised, but he quickly reacted by moving his shield. When he blocked the punch of Brian, Brando immediately used his skill shield bash. Arg! Brian flew away and crashed on the ground. He wiped the blood on his mouth and a shadow covered him. He looked up and saw that Brando was going straight at him. Shield smash. Brian quickly moved his body sideways to avoid the attack. Brando smashed his shield and it hit the ground. Spiderweb cracks appeared on the ground. Brando looked up and saw that Brian was gone. Then, he felt something on his back. He tightened his grip on his shield and waved it behind him. Unfortunately, Brian reacted as fast as him, so Brian avoided the shield. Arg! Brian raised his fist and smashed the ground. Smoke and dust shot up in the air. Not good. Brando quickly waved his shield to disperse the smoke, but Brian was faster than him. What? Brando felt a pair of hands grabbed his waist. He turned around, saw that Brian was grabbing him with a smirk on his face. I finally got you. Brian said with a smile. Brando's going to release his full power. Souta muttered while looking at the two. What do you mean by that? Alice asked him. Do you really think that's Brando's full strength? No, that's not his full strength. In his previous battle, he hasn't released his full strength. You can see that by seeing how he breathes and how tired he is. In the battle, it's okay if you overestimate your opponent, but you must never underestimate them. It will cause your downfall. Souta said. Alice glanced at Souta's face. After a few moments, she opened her mouth. Is it coming from your experience or not? Souta lowered his eyes and looked at her. You can also say it like that. Shielder's aura. Brando emitted a greenish aura. This skill was one of the important combat arts of a shield class. It raised the user's defense by 100% and damage reduction by 20%. Although it was a low-level skill, the effect was higher compared to other high-level skills. Brando turned his eyes to Brian. He opened his mouth and slowly said, it would be great if you could use your spell, but unfortunately you can't, so there's no doubt that you will lose against me. Then I can only use my combat arts. Brian smiled. Even in this situation, he could still smile. You will not be able to damage with my Shielder's aura on, Brando stated. Chapter 50, Semi-Finals 2. I will try if I could learn that skill late. Souta muttered in a low voice while looking at Brando, who was emitting a greenish aura. He knew the effect of Shielder's aura, so it will help him in his quest. If he could learn that skill, then there's a possibility that he could learn the skill of other classes. Thinking about other classes, he couldn't help but recall Yuko. He would try to learn the skills of Tamer class later. If he learned it, then he would be able to launch a combination attack with Yuko. He grinned thinking about Yuko. Alice looked at him and saw him grinning. She wondered why he's always like that. Grinning without any reason. She shook her head and put those thoughts out of her mind. She focused her attention on the fight before her. Brian fiercely attacked Brando using both of his hands. He threw several punches and Brando received it without taking any damage. Stop wasting your time. Brando said, and he used shield bash to push Brian away. Arg. Brian rolled on the ground a few times before he stopped. He opened his eyes and looked at Brando. I said before that you will not be able to damage me with that kind of attack. Brando paused for a moment before he added, I always want to become the greatest shield. I came from the green mithril turtle family. My family always boasted that they have the toughest body, but I'm just a halfling. I don't have their tough body. I just train non-stop ever since I was a child to become the greatest shield. Why are you saying this to me? Brian asked as he slowly stood up. I'm just saying this so that you understand that I'm different from your previous opponents. I'm not gifted like other people. I acquired this strength through hard work. Brandon said. Well, I'm going to start now. As soon as he said those words, he dashed towards Brian. Arg. Brian gritted his teeth and he clenched his fist tightly. Flames emerged and coated his fist. Brando raised his shield and it emitted a bluish light. Titanium crash. A shield and a first collided, causing a shockwave to swept out in the whole area. The floor beneath them cracked and debris of rocks flew away. The crowd covered their eyes as they were afraid that dust would go inside their eyes. The teachers and the rankers used their mana to protect them from shockwaves. Souta waved his hand and he controlled his mana. His mana protected him and Alice, also the students behind them. Really powerful. Souta muttered while looking at the scene. The students here really have strong combat arts while he only had dash and stab. Alex looked around and saw that some students didn't know how to control their mana, so he took the initiative to protect them. What a troublesome first year. He waved his hand and he emitted a large amount of mana. The mana covered the entire area and protect everyone from the aftershocks of the battle. Souta and the rest who were using their mana stopped when they saw Alex covered the whole battleground with his mana. What a dense and powerful mana. Souta muttered. He could see Alex's mana with his own two eyes. The mana was so dense that he could see it with his own eyes. The teachers here in the Lodro Institute were unfathomable. They were not the teacher of the most famous institute for nothing. Blazing strike. Titanium crash. The ground continued to shake as the two used their combat arts without minding their surroundings. Arg. Brian was pushed away. Blood flew out of his mouth. It's hard to fight without using mana. He thought while looking at Brando. Brando didn't escape their clash unscathed. He took a few burn marks in his body, but it was not as bad as Brian's wounds. I admire you. If you can only use your mana, then you would have a chance to defeat me. Brando said as he slowly walked towards Brian. Brando stopped in front of Brian and he slowly raised his shield. Let's fight again. He said as he brought down his shield towards Brian. Brian clenched his fist and used blazing strike once again. Shockwaves swept out like ripples in the air as both of their attacks collided. Give up, now, Brando said as he used his strength to push down his shield. Arg, I will not fall down easily. Brian gritted his teeth as he pushed the shield using his fist. That's right, Brian, struggle until the end. Tire him out, so that I could defeat him without any efforts. Souta looked at the two with a smirk on his face. If he saved more stamina in this tournament, Souta would complete some quest after the class. He doesn't want to drain his stamina. To think that Brian would last for a long time is out of my expectations. Souta said. He still couldn't accurately grasp the strength of Brian. He looked at Alice and asked, if you win your fight against Brian, then how long do you think you can last against Brando? You're not asking me if I could win. Alice looked at Souta with cold eyes. She couldn't believe that Souta already assumed that she would lose to Brando. Yeah, if you could use your mana, then I'm going to ask if you could win, but unfortunately not, Souta said. Alice snorted and turned her head away. Fall down. Brando roared as he used every strength he has to bring down Brian. A large explosion occurred. It was larger than before as thick smoke blocked the vision of the crowd. The crowd couldn't see what's happening. They just waited for the smoke to disperse to see the outcome of the match. Bargain closed his eyes and said, the fight was already finished. Yeah, that was a good fight. Kanda nodded his head. They showed us some spectacular fight. This shows that some first year could already pull down those weak second year. Zack said. You're weak too. Rain commented at the side. Oi, I'm the 6th rank, so I'm not that weak. Zack smiled wryly as he scratched the back of his head. After a few seconds, the smoke slowly dissipated. Everyone saw Brando was still standing holding his shield while Brian was knocked out. Huff. Brando breathed as he looked at Brian, then at Alex. Brando win the match. Alex declared that Brando's win. Brando smiled and he raised his fist in the air. The crowd clapped because of the great fight he showed. Looking at the Souta couldn't help but smile. He closed his eyes and felt the surroundings. Okay, I'm next. I'm not going to show any mercy as I'm gonna knock him out as fast as I can. Souta muttered as he crossed his arms. Can you really do what you said? Alice asked him. Souta looked at her and said, if Brando is stronger than what he showed in this fight, then I would only have a few problems, but I already expect that, but if he's 3 times stronger, then that's really a problem. You really have a lot of confidence in yourself, Alice muttered. Anyway, you became talkative today, huh? Souta looked at her with a smile. Alice looked at him with widened eyes before she turned her head. Don't mind me, let's just help Brian, Souta said as he approached the unconscious Brian. The clerics also approached Brian and they checked his condition. After learning that Brian didn't receive any grave injuries, Souta left. He let Brian rest there to recover his strength. Souta checked the time and saw that there's still time before the finals. He turned his head and saw that Brando was trying to recover his strength as fast as possible. That's not bad. He stretched his body to ready himself before the match. Alice took a distance away from Souta as he was the center of everyone's attention. After all, he was one of the fighters in the final, so a lot of people were eager to watch his fight with Brando. Souta looked at his stamina in the system and saw that he still have a lot left. He would try to reserve his fight in this battle. Get ready, fighters. Alex's voice echoed in the whole area. Brando, who was resting in the corner, opened his eyes. He looked at Souta before he picked up his shield and stood up. Souta saw Brando's look and he smiled. It's already time, huh? He then walked to the center and faced Brando. The distance between them was 5 meters. Brando has a serious expression while Souta was looking as if he was amused by what's happening. Try to struggle as much as you can, Souta said to Brando. Chapter 51, Finals. Try to struggle as much as you can. Let me see your strength or else you will fall easily. Souta said to Brando. Naturally, Brando wasn't the only one who heard his words, the audience too heard his words. Oi, that's some cheeky first year, Zack said. Then he recalled a certain individual. He turned his head to Rain and said, you remind me of him. You're a trash talker too, right? Don't compare me to him. USCU. Rain said with an annoyed tone. I can't wait to see it. Zack turned his head and saw that Yanagi, the number 1, was still here. It seems that she's much more excited than usual. Don't tell me. He turned his head and looked at the 2 contestants of the finals. Ha ha ha, so he's like that. Kanda laughed when he heard Souta's words. I'm still not familiar with my students, so I don't know much about their personality. Bargain said as he closed his eyes. Highs. Souta sighed when he heard the audience started to murmur. He could hear some of them were saying some mean things to him. I'm just saying the truth, why won't they believe it? Anyway. Souta grinned at Brando. He slightly bent his knees and crouched on the ground. He looked at Brando and said, be prepared. You don't know what will happen next. Brando was looking at Souta with a frown on his face. He wanted to rush towards him, but his intuition was telling him that's not a good idea. Something was wrong about this Souta. He tightened his guard as he observed Souta's every movement. Then, he widened his eyes as Souta instantly appeared in front of him. He tried to raise his shield, but Souta was faster than him. My body's too slow to follow his movements. He thought. The plus 200 agility and dexterity of the Vajra sword Saya wasn't for display. If he displayed the full speed of his stats, then only a few first years would be able to follow his movements, but that's only followed him with their eyes, as their body and reflexes were too slow to follow him. Souta opened his palm and grabbed Brando's face. Fall down. He then smashed Brando on the ground. Go. Souta tightened his grip on Brando's face. He raised him once again before he smashed him on the ground. Ha. Souta's muscles bulged out and he threw Brando in the air. He then followed him in the air. I told you to prepare. Souta said as he raised his arm in the air before he brought it down, smashing Brando. Arg. Brando crashed on the ground, creating a small crater. He spat a mouthful of blood. Souta wouldn't stop at all. He's going straight to Brando, intending to destroy him. As soon as his punch landed on Brando's face, he quickly took a distance away. It was because he saw that Brando used the shielder's aura. He hasn't used any combat arts at all. His abilities were surprising. Kanda was surprised when he saw this. He finally understood why Souta had the guts to say something like that before the match. Not just his abilities. He does everything with absolute confidence, and you can see it in his face. Bargain said as he looked at Souta's smirk. He's more on the fighter side. He's not using any flashy combat arts. He's a textbook fighter. Zack said while looking at Souta. To be frank, if he didn't know that Souta was a mage, he would think that he's from the fighter class. Ah, beautiful. He heard Yanagi's voice at his side. He rubbed his temple and thought that this would become a problem. Every person that she got interested in was destroyed to the point that they quit the institute and hole up in their room. The only one who persisted until the end was Rain, the rank number 2. I wonder what will you do once Yanagi pursue you? Zack thought while looking at Souta. That's why I surrendered. Yujin, the one who surrendered before fighting Souta, said. He had a feeling that Souta's physical abilities exceeded those of the other class, and it's true. His decision wasn't wrong at all. If he fought Souta, then he would suffer great injuries. He wasn't a fighter but a swordsman who's using magic. It would be inconvenient for him if he would fight without using magic. He's also not the type of person to fight even if they saw that they don't have a chance to win. He will only fight someone if he saw that he have a 50% chance to win, lower than that he wouldn't bother himself. Brando stood up as he wiped the blood on the mouth. He looked at Souta and said, you will not be able to damage me without using combat arts. Ah, is that so? Let me tell you something. You're much slower than I am, so you wouldn't be able to avoid my attack. Souta said as he opened his palm, looking at Brando with an amused expression. I don't need to avoid your attack, Brando said. He's talking so much so that he could recover a little bit of his strength. He wanted to avoid direct confrontation with his current condition. It's true that with your shielders aura most of my will be ineffective, but it's not that you're not taking any damage at all. If my punches before were damaging you 40, then with your skill on you only took 5 damage. Do you know what it means? Souta knew what Brando was doing. He's just letting him do what he wants, for now. I don't. Brando replied. It means that if I punch you 100 times using that 5 damage, then the damage you took would accumulate to the point that you couldn't handle it. Also, if I just targeted your head, then do you think you can hold out 100 punches only aiming at your head? Souta pointed at his head as he patiently explained what he was saying to Brando. Brando didn't know what to say anymore. He knew that Souta's words were right. The difference in their speed was large. He could follow Souta with his eyes, but his large body was too slow to react, so even if he could see Souta's movements, it was pointless if he couldn't even defend. Okay, let's stop talking, I will start now. Souta shrugged his shoulder and he started to walk towards Brando. Brando tensed his muscle and expanded his senses. He took a deep breath and braced himself. The whole training ground was devoid of any sounds as no one dared to talk. They just focused their attention on Souta. Souta's footsteps echoed as he slowly walked towards Brando. Souta opened his mouth and slowly said, "Actually, I don't want to use this at all, but I don't have a choice now, do I?" Brando subconsciously took a step back. He then saw that Souta was already gone. What dash? I'm here. Souta appeared behind Brando. He grabbed the handle of the Vajra sword Saya and pulled it out of its scabbard. He quickly slashed Brando's back using the Vajra sword Saya. Arg! A large cut appeared on Brando's back. His blood flew in the air and some splattered on the ground. Souta quickly sheathed his sword. He looked around him. It seems that some people with sharp eyes saw the abilities of his sword. He pulled out his sword and placed it as fast as he could, but he couldn't escape the eyes of those powerful teachers. Some of them would gain some idea about his sword. Souta turned around and walked away. Alex then declared the winner of the tournament. At the same time, Souta heard a familiar sound in his head. Congratulations on completing the tournament quest. You've received 5000 EXP, 2 free attribute points, and 1 skill point. Nice, a skill point. Souta was glad that he received skill point in this quest. Although it was only 1, it was still better than none. It didn't matter to him if he doesn't receive EXP or attribute points. There were many ways to earn EXP. Just farm outside the city and you will earn a huge amount of EXP. That's also the case for attribute points. Just find some rare fruits or potions to increase your attributes. But skill points were different, it could only be earned by completing a quest. To think that everyone forgot his sword, Kanda said. He was the teacher of the sword class 2C, so he instantly guessed just from 1/ how proficient Souta in using the sword. Yeah, it's the first time he used his sword, and you see it too, right? Bargain said. Yeah, that's not an ordinary sword. It could pierce through the shielder's aura like a thin paper. Kanda nodded. He looked down at the sword that was hanging on his waist. He felt that the quality of Souta's sword was higher than his sword. What about his sword skills? Bargain asked. It's high. I couldn't even believe that he enrolled in the mage class. His sword skill is already at the level of my students. Kanda said in disbelief. In terms of proficiency in using sword skill, Souta was without a doubt higher than any first-year students. After all, Souta's sword mastery was level 2. Chapter 52, Another Day. The audience slowly left the training ground as the tournament was finished. They remembered those students who showed great potential in this tournament. They won't forget it. The ranking was going to start soon and the second and third year couldn't wait to see who's going to rise in the first-year batch. Only the students of Shield class and Mage class were left in the training ground. Alex gave Souta the authority to do anything wanted in his subject. He could even skip the class and only participate in the exams. Right now, the students of Mage class and Shield class have a bit of understanding to each other after the tournament, so they would grow closer in the future. Alex said something about their next class before he dismissed the class. Souta stood up and patted his clothes. He looked around and saw Brian in the back. Come on Alice, let's check Brian, Souta said to Alice before he walked towards Brian. Alice reluctantly followed behind him. Are you okay? Souta asked Brian, who just woke up from his deep sleep. Yeah, it's just hard to move my body, Brian replied as he tried to move his arms. Remember to rest, you will join me in my quest this weekend, right? Souta said to him so that Brian wouldn't do any reckless stuff. Ah, I forgot about that. Don't worry, I will be back into full force at that time. Brian said with a smile. Souta turned his head and looked at Alice. He asked her. Do you want to join us, Alice? I'm not an adventurer. Alice hesitated before she answered him. It doesn't matter, Souta said. Well, I won't force you if you really don't want. Hello. A voice came behind them causing them to turn their head. They saw Brando standing beside them. What do you want? Do you want another match? Brian said carefully. He was alerted by the sudden appearance of his opponent who defeated him. Childish. Alice commented at the side. I'm Brando Hilot, I will train harder and defeat you the next time we fight, Souta, Brando said with a smile as he raised his fist and clenched it tightly. Souta looked at Brando before he smirked. Good, I will wait for it. Me too, I will beat the two of you next time. Brian joined them. Haha, you can come at me anytime you want. Souta laughed. I will go now, see you later. Brando bid farewell to them before he left. Souta looked at Brando's back and said, he's the same as you, Brian. Huh? Same. Brian didn't understand what he was saying. Forget about it, you wouldn't understand even if I tell you. Souta shrugged. He turned his eyes to Alice and said, he ignored you, you know. Huh? It was Alice's turn to be surprised. Why would that matter? You don't get it, he didn't ignore me and Brian, so it means that he acknowledged our strength, but you. Souta said as he raised his finger and shook it in front of her. So you're telling that I'm weak? Alice's tone turned colder. Haha, I'm not, Brando is the one. So train and defeat him next time. Souta laughed. They talked for a while before they left the institute. Souta went to the market first to buy something for Yuko. There's still some time left, so he would try to finish some lower rank quest. He gave Yuko the food he bought in the market before they went towards the Adventurers Guild. He picked up some herb picking quest and finished it quickly. He went back to the inn when the sky was already dark. He placed the Vajra sword Saya in the corner of the room before he lay down on the bed. I'm tired. Souta gazed at the ceiling as he stretched his body across the bed. It really feels good to lay down on a soft bed if you're tired. The next thing I will do is to fulfill the requirements for the second evolution. This weekend Brian will join his party and help him complete the requirements under the guise of Adventurer's Quest. Both of them will travel to the place between Melosa Country and Hebrae Kingdom. The journey will take 1.5 days before they arrive there. The place between Melosa Country and Hebrae Kingdom was a forest called Desolate Woods. It became a battlefield when Melosa Country waged a war against Hebrae Kingdom. On the outskirts of the Desolate Woods was dry land. It was in that place when Bargain single-handedly pushed back the army of Melosa Country. That time Bargain's name shook the whole kingdom. He was later called the Fire Master as his fire magic was too powerful that it could even destroy a city. He needed Brian's help to get the rotten venomous green apple. This apple was very lethal to those level 20 and below, but since it's in the requirements he doesn't need to worry about the effect. The apple was inside the low-level dungeon there and it was guarded by a powerful undead. The dungeon wasn't entirely a low-level dungeon, it's difficultly hover between the low-level and mid-level dungeon. It was because of the boss of the dungeon. If he wasn't wrong, it was the level 30 undead Cyclops. The other requirement for his next evolution was the flesh of level 20 and above undead. Since the boss of the dungeon was a level 30 undead, he doesn't need to worry about the requirements. It's time for the second evolution. Souta couldn't help but grin about his next evolution. It's still version 1, but he could exceed level 20. He guessed that he could reach level 30 before version 1 end. The demon would start to appear in the early part of version 2 and some countries would fight among each other. It would start to get chaotic in version 2. But since he could exceed the level cap, there's nothing to worry about. Level 40 was enough to finish the quest in the upcoming version, that's why the level cap of version 2 was 40. If a player exceeded level 40, then they would easily finish the quest of version 2. But he joined the mechanic country in the game when it was still in version 1. He hasn't left the mechanic country until the latest version, that's the reason why he became the commander of mechanic country. Almost half of the quest that he did in the game was related to the mechanic country. He became the commander because of his deeds when the mechanic country expanded their territory in the 3 neighboring countries. The next morning, Souta went downstairs to have breakfast. After that, he fed Yuko her breakfast before he went straight to the institute. It's still early, so he went to the cafeteria and bought coffee. He went to the classroom and drank his coffee there. After a few minutes, Brian and Alice arrived. You're early, Souta. Brian said. Yeah, good morning. Souta nodded and greeted the two. Morning, Alice replied as she sat down in her seat beside Souta. Souta turned to Brian and asked, how's your injury? Well, as you can see. Brian smiled as he flexed his muscle. I'm fine. Be prepared. We will meet at the Adventurers Guild tomorrow morning. Souta said. Okay. Brian nodded. Remember to go there 6 a.m. I will leave you behind if I found that you're not there. Souta added. What? You will leave me behind? How can you do that to your friend? Brian exclaimed loudly, causing their classmates to turn their heads to look at him. Don't mind him, he's just hit his head. Souta smiled wryly and said to his classmates. Highs. Souta sighed and took a sip of his coffee. At least, the coffee here is good, just the right taste for my taste bud. He closed his eyes and silently enjoyed the taste of the coffee. He heard Brian was talking to his seatmate. Brian was a straightforward type of person. He then slowly opened his eyes and glanced at Alice, who was beside him. Alice was silently looking outside the windows while supporting her head with her hand. Silent type, huh? He muttered before he took another sip of the coffee. Good. After a few minutes, Bargain came and started the class. The students listened carefully to Bargain's lectures. While Souta was looking at the words that Bargain wrote on the blackboard, he heard something. Souta looked over and saw that Brian was sleeping in the middle of the class. It seems that he's still tired because of the battle yesterday, so he didn't bother Brian and let him sleep there. Souta went back to listen to Bargain. Bargain also was ignoring Brian as he continued his lectures. But there's one classmate that couldn't tolerate this kind of behavior. Excuse me, teacher Bargain, but Brian is sleeping. Lamilia pointed at Brian. Haha. Souta laughed lightly as he guessed what type of person Lamilia is. Chapter 53, Hunters. The next day, Souta woke up early in the morning. He quickly went to the bathroom to wash his face, then he went downstairs to have breakfast. After that, Souta went to the ranch to feed Yuko. We're going out, Yuko. I will introduce you to my classmate. Souta said while looking at Yuko, who was eating her breakfast. Mew. Yuko looked at him for a second before she went back to eat her food. Souta smiled looking at her. Souta and Yuko arrived in the Adventurers Guild and found that Brian was already there waiting for him. Yo. Brian. Souta called Brian while he raised his hand. Oh. Souta. What's that? Brian said while pointing at the huge bear behind Souta. This. She's Yuko, my partner. Souta said. Don't tell me. You're the rumored tamer. Brian said while looking at Yuko. Yeah. Souta could only nod his head. He tried to recall if there were any other tamer in the city and found none in his memory. Most of the tamer could be found in Ambrosi. Ambrosi was a powerful country that was situated in the north of the Forest of Light. It was a country where people didn't discriminate monsters, as most of them were tamers. This was also the reason why other countries, who suffered from the monster tide, were isolating the country. They tried to bring down the Ambrosi many times, but unfortunately for them, Ambrosi's army was extremely powerful. Oh. I didn't think that you're a tamer, at all. Brian said in amazement as his mouth turned into an O shape. Souta noticed that the Adventurers Guild was strangely quiet this time. He asked Brian about this. I think someone said that the hunters are here. Brian replied. Hunters? Souta rubbed his chin. He looked at Brian and asked, are you sure that it's the hunters? I don't. I only heard it while standing here. Brian tilted his head. Okay, wait for me here. Souta said before he approached one adventurer. Can you tell me what's happening? He asked the adventurer. There's a sighting of basilisk with monster orb near the city, so the hunters came here to subjugate that monster. The adventurer said. Thank you. Souta thanked the adventurer before he turned about, but the adventurer called him. Hey. Souta turned around and looked at the adventurer. Is there something wrong? You're a tamer, right? The adventurer asked Souta. Yeah. Souta nodded in response to his question. Be careful. Don't offend them. The hunters have deep hatred on the monsters. One wrong move and they will kill your pet. The adventurer warned him. Okay, thanks for the warning. If they come at Yuko then. Souta's voice turned colder. I will kill them all. Souta went back to Brian. Let's go. He said as he picked up his luggage. Yosh. Brian raised his fist up in the air. Yuko just followed behind Souta without making any sound. Should I try to hunt that basilisk? But, with this force, I don't think it's possible. Souta thought as he turned his head to look at Brian and Yuko. All the monster that gained monster orb was level 40 and above. The beast energy the monster orb produced was extremely potent to the point that it could kill an ordinary human or demi, level 1 to 5, just by making contact with the beast energy. It was poisonous to those lower life forms. It was one of the reasons why those countries tried to exterminate monsters. No ordinary human or demi could escape alive once they made a contact with level 40 monster. Even if we could hunt it? There's no time left because the hunters could leave the Adventurers Guild anytime. Souta thought. He doesn't have time to deal with level 40 monster, as it will need a lot of time and preparation to hunt it. Also, the hunters will get angry at him if he stole their job. It will give them a reason to trouble him. The hunters were a specialist in dealing monster. They were the force of Adventurers Guild that only took the monster subjugation quest. To become a hunter, a person needed to become a rank B adventurer. In other words, each one of them was powerful in their own right. It's not something that a monster who only undergo first evolution like him could handle. The hunters were also the problem of the monster character players in the game. The hunters chase those players until they die. It was also the reason why monster players banded together and attacked the main guild of the Adventurers Guild in the Nivera Kingdom. It was chaotic in the Nivera Kingdom at that time as the players killed every NPC they saw. It only stopped when the S-rank adventurer annihilated the players. Souta shook his head and removed those thoughts in his mind. Right now, his priority was to complete the requirements of his second evolution. Say, Souta, where would we go now? Brian asked him with an excited expression. The desolate woods, Souta replied. Brian exclaimed, then he asked, what it is? Heis. Souta sighed. He then said, the forest between Hebre Kingdom and Melosa country. That's it? Brian said as he understood where they would go. He then tilted his head and looked at Souta. Isn't that place pretty far? Yeah, that's why we would miss the class if we took longer than what I expect, Souta said. I don't want to miss the class. Come, let's go finish it quickly. Yesterday, Souta took the escort quest to the village near the desolate woods, so they don't need to walk. They had a smooth journey as they didn't encounter any bandits on the way. It took them 1.5 days before they arrived in the Dry Gulch town. Dry Gulch town was the largest town in this area. It has a population more than 10,000. Many humans and demi visited this place, and some huge corporations even went their way here to sell their merchandise. Since this town wasn't part of any country or kingdom, the merchants used this chance to expand their business here. The tax here was lower compared to those huge countries and kingdoms. They would export products from other countries to this town, so it's not easy to guess why this town was more advanced than other towns. Oh, so this is the Dry Gulch town? Brian exclaimed when he saw the bustling town. There were people everywhere and shops. It looks like a city than a town. A lot of people turned their heads to look at him. It was rare to see a tamer in this place. All of them focused their attention on the group of one human, one demi, and one monster. It's nice, right? Souta said as he stepped forward and entered the town. He ignored the gazes of the people around him. Let's go. Brian was excited as he rushed forward. Let's check in an inn first, Souta said to Brian. Brian turned his head and said, I know. Both of them checked in an inn and left their luggage there before they went inside the Adventurers Guild. The Adventurers Guild looks the same as the one in Ladro City. They have the same looks and materials, and even the interior part of the building was the same as the one in Ladro City. Souta opened the door and looked inside the guild. They saw many round tables that were full of different people laughing and chatting. Some of them were looking at the quest, finding a quest suitable for them, and the others were talking to the receptionist. Souta and Brian stepped inside the guild. Some of the people glanced at them while the others didn't bother looking at them. They knew that a lot of different people came in and out of the Adventurers Guild. First, we need to let the receptionist record our quest, Souta said as he fall in line. Okay. Brian nodded and followed him. They needed the receptionist to record the escort quest that they completed. It will help them have a good record in their adventurer's ID. It will increase their completion rate, and some of the people will personally make a quest for them. Just like some of the nobles that have personal adventurers. Those nobles didn't make a request to the guild, but they instead personally request those adventurers that they trust. The rewards of their quest were much higher than normal, so a lot of adventurers wanted a noble to hire them. Souta and Brian sat down in a vacant chair. Souta noticed that some of the adventurers were acting strangely. They were restless while talking about something. Brian wasn't that sensitive in his surroundings, so he doesn't have any idea about the strange atmosphere. Wait here. Souta said to Brian before he stopped up and approached the table beside him. Did something happen here? Souta asked the three adventurers. The three adventurers looked at Souta before they looked at each other. You know there's a sighting of mystical light cherry? What? Souta exclaimed loudly when he heard the words mystical light cherry. Chapter 54, Mystical Light Cherry. Souta was surprised when he heard the words mystical light fruit. He looked at the three adventurers and once again asked if it's really the mystical light fruit. The three adventurers looked at each other for a second before they replied. Well, you see. It's just a rumor, but we think that it's true. The one in the center looked around and carefully said, you see. A lot of higher rank adventurers are gathering here, so it's probably true. Even some nobles from Melosa country are here. I see. Souta nodded at them and once again asked them. So, can you tell me where they saw the mystical light cherry? Desolate woods. They answered his question in a simple way. Okay, thanks for telling me. Souta thanked them before he left. Souta rubbed his chin and pondered what he should do. It was probably true that the mystical light cherry was in the desolate woods. If those nobles were involved here, then they must have silenced the one who saw it and spread the words. Since the person who saw it was nowhere to be found, the other people thought that it was just a rumor with no clear evidence. It will be hard dealing with those nobles, but since they came from the Malosa country, Souta wouldn't hold back at all if they bothered him. The nobles from Malosa country were hard to deal if he was staying in the Malosa country, but since he was staying in Hebre Kingdom and the distance between them was huge, he doesn't need to worry about them causing trouble for him. His priority right now was to get the rotten venomous green apple. If he had energy left after he acquired the fruit, then he wouldn't mind taking the mystical light cherry for himself. Also, Brian and Yuko were here with him, so he could probably save more stamina in completing that low-level dungeon. He needed to save his strength if he wanted to compete for the mystical light cherry. The battle for the cherry was going to get chaotic as nobles were involved. Mystical light cherry was a type of fruit called mana fruit. It could greatly enhance the consumer's mana capacity and mana manipulation. The consumer's senses over mana will increase greatly. If Souta wasn't wrong, the mystical light cherry could increase a person's mana capacity by 100 and also level up the mana manipulation skill by 1. The only problem was that a person will only receive the full benefits of the fruit if they consumed it for the first time. If someone who ate the fruit before consumed the cherry, then they will only receive half of the benefits. For subsequent use, the effect of the fruit will lessen until a person wouldn't receive any benefits. Souta left the Adventurers Guild and saw Brian and Yuko waiting for him. "What did you do?" Brian asked him curiously. "I just talked to some adventurers there," Souta replied. "I know that. I see you talking to them for a while, so I decided to wait outside." "Say, what are you talking about?" Brian asked him. "I'm just gathering information about our quest," Souta answered him. "Yosh. So how is it?" "I'm ready to depart any time to complete the quest," Brian said with an excited expression. "We're departing tomorrow morning. We just arrived here, so we need to rest first, then we can go all out tomorrow," Souta said. "Ah. Why? I wanted to complete it soon. I don't want to skip class, you know," Brian complained. "It's important to rest," Souta said, and he called Yuko. Souta and Yuko walked away. Brian looked at them as he dropped his shoulders. He reluctantly followed behind them. He doesn't know what quest it is, so he couldn't complete it alone. If he only knew the quest, then he would go out to complete it this night. The three of them went back to the inn. Brian and Souta sat in the vacant table before they ordered their food. "Enjoy yourself, sir," the waitress said as she placed the food that they ordered on top of their table. "Thanks." Souta and Brian thanked her at the same time. Souta looked at the food and placed his palm together. "Thanks for the meal." "Oh ho. It looks delicious," Brian said while looking at the meal with stars in his eyes. He licked his lips before he began to eat his food. Souta looked at Brian and said, "We will go to the desolate woods 6 a.m., so wake up early. We will investigate the outskirt of the woods to see if there is something wrong." "Why?" Brian looked at him with a question mark all over his head. He couldn't understand why they need to investigate the woods first. "To see how many opponents we have, and also to see the danger lies in the woods. We don't even know how powerful our competitors," Souta explained to Brian. Brian could only nod his head. He couldn't understand what Souta was saying. "Hiss." Souta sighed and he pinched his nose bridge. He knew that Brian didn't understand him. He just needed to keep Brian, and once the battle started, that's Brian's stage. Brian could help him greatly in battles. He lifted up his head and looked at Brian. "I will count on you when the battle starts." "Yeah, you can count on me," Brian said as he patted his chest. Souta and Brian finished their meal before they went to their own room to rest. Souta stretched his body and took off his clothes. He then lied down on the soft bed. He looked at the ceiling and took a deep breath. He relaxed his muscles and he slowly felt tired. Souta yawned as drowsiness hit him. He placed the Vajra sword Saya on his side before he closed his eyes and fell asleep. Souta woke up before 5 a.m. He sat up and looked around the room. It was still dark outside. He stood up and he stretched his body. He crouched down and did some exercise. After that, Souta went to the bathroom and washed the sweat on his body. "Oh, that was a good bath," Souta exclaimed. He picked up a towel and used it to dry his hair. He then went downstairs and ordered a meal for his breakfast. Souta heard someone coming down. He turned his head and found that it was Brian. "Yo. Brian." Souta greeted him. "Good morning, Souta," Brian replied, and he sat down in the seat opposite of Souta. "You're early, huh?" Souta said. "Yeah, I always woke up before 6, Brian said. He was used to waking up early. "What was it called again?" "Body clock," Souta said. "Yeah, that's right. It's body clock." Brian nodded at him. "Here's your order, sir." The waitress came. She quietly placed his order on the table. "Okay, Thank you. Souta thanked her. Brian looked at Souta's meal and asked, "Where's mine?" Huh? Souta looked at him with a confused expression. "Where's mine?" Brian repeated what he said. Huh? You just came here. Why are you thinking that I would order a meal for you? Souta asked him. Eh? You didn't. Brian looked surprised at Souta's words. Of course, why would I bother myself to order your meal if I don't even know what time will you wake up? Souta said as if it was expected. He picked up the spoon and began to eat his meal. Brian had no choice but to accept his defeat. He ordered a meal for one person with his shoulder dropped. After they finished having breakfast, they went to Yuko to give her her breakfast. Souta was holding a cup of coffee while looking at Yuko, who was eating her breakfast. He took a sip and looked in the sky. The sun was already shining brightly in the sky. I feel that something is going to happen. He muttered while looking at the blue sky. Oh ho. Yuko's quite a good eater. Brian said as he continued to give Yuko a slice of meat. He was clearly having fun as Yuko ate every meat he threw at her. You're having too much fun, Souta said to Brian. What's wrong with that? Brian replied. His focus was still on Yuko. Heis. You know that you need the owner's permission if you want to play with his pet. Souta said as he took a sip and glanced at Brian. Is that so? Brian exclaimed as he turned his head and looked at Souta with widened eyes. I guess so. Souta smiled and he didn't further explain it to him. Hurry up with that. We'll go now. Oh okay. Brian replied. After 30 minutes. Yosh. Let's go. Brian shouted with both of his hands above his head. Souta smirked as he walked forward. Mew. Yuko followed behind Souta. The three of them walked to the direction of the desolate woods. Chapter 55, Encounter in the Desolate Woods. So this is the desolate woods, Brian muttered while looking at the vast forest in front of him. Yeah. Be careful, a lot of powerful monsters inhabited this forest. Souta said to Brian. Yeah. Brian nodded. First, we will scout the outer area of the forest, Souta said. Come, follow me. He walked forward and entered the forest. Okay. Brian nodded and he followed Souta while looking at his surroundings. Yuko was also observing the surrounding around her. Her senses were higher than a human and a goblin. Her level was also higher than Souta and she was in her second evolution, so it's not that surprising if her stats were higher than Souta. When Souta met her for the first time, he knew that this bear was much stronger than him. Her stats were clearly higher than him and he was exhausted at that time because he ran over 600 kilometers that day. In fact, Yuko would be able to kill him that day if she only used her trait skill. He didn't have much stamina to move his body that day. She just underestimated him and it caused her downfall. Souta's group walked for a few minutes before Souta stopped. Souta looked at them and raised his hand signaling them to stop. What's wrong, Souta? Brian asked curiously. SHH. Souta placed his finger on his mouth and he pointed at the bushes 20 meters away from them. Brian looked ahead and saw a 2 meters tall spider. The giant spider had 8 sharp pointed limbs. It has a hard exoskeleton that looks like a metal plate and its color was glossy black. It shone brightly as the sun rays hit the exoskeleton. What's that? Brian asked in a low voice while looking at the giant spider. Gur. Yuko growled in a low voice. She felt danger coming out of that giant spider. That's a black tusk spider, Souta said and he explained to them what it is. Black tusk spider was a powerful monster that inhabited the desolate woods. The spider hunted their prey using their sharp limbs. They rarely used their web in battle as they mostly used it in building their nest. Their level was between 20 and 39, just like Yuko, a red fur bear. The black tusk spider was a second evolved species. Souta explained to them that it was most likely a male black tusk spider because of its size. The female black tusk spider was larger than the male ones. It was also stronger and it possessed traits that males don't have. So what should we do? Brian asked. Wait here for a while. I will scout the area first. If it's the only monster here then we're gonna hunt it? Souta said. Okay. Brian nodded his head. Yuko, you also wait here. Souta looked at Yuko. He then turned at Brian and added, if I attack it then you can also start attacking. Good. Souta was satisfied that Brian was following his command. He was worried that Brian would suddenly attack the spider but fortunately, he was worried for nothing. Souta jumped in the branch of the tree and looked around. He moved to the other tree to see the area around him clearly. He moved in a circle around the black tusk spider. Okay, good. There's no other monster here. Souta muttered before he looked at the black tusk spider. He opened his palm and silently cast Shadow Bind. The spider was surprised when the shadow beneath moved. The shadow strangled the limbs of the spider. Brian, who was hiding in the bushes, jumped forward when he saw Souta cast a spell. Ah! He gathered his mana on his fist and threw a punch on the abdomen of the spider. Souta followed Brian as he threw a punch towards the spider. He then grabbed the handle of his sword and pulled it out. Since no one was here, he could freely use the Vajra sword. Geek! The spider broke free from the shadows. It quickly moved its limbs and it aimed at Souta's head. Souta tilted his head and sharp limbs grazed his cheek. He tightened his grip on the handle of his sword and swung it. His sword sliced the limbs of the spider like a hot knife cutting through a butter. The spider screeched loudly as it felt the pain from its limbs. Souta saw flames behind the spider and he jumped away. He saw Brian use the blazing strike. The spider flew away and it crashed in the trees. Souta quickly chased after the spider. He raised his sword and threw it towards the spider. The sword pierced through the body of the spider. In an instant, Souta arrived as he grabbed his sword and swung it upward, slicing the body of the spider in half. You've received 478 EXP from defeating a black tusk spider. Souta heard the system prompt in his mind while putting back his sword in the scabbard. I hardly do anything from that, Brian complained. Yuko didn't even move. It's better if you save your strength for the upcoming battle. Souta said to him. Okay. I hope we finish this quest soon. Brian's shoulder dropped. Don't be disappointed with this. There's a lot of monsters here, so don't worry. You will fight later even if you don't want it? Souta smiled. Souta's group wandered around the outer part of the desolate woods for about an hour. They hunted down every monster that they met. Souta was using the Vajra sword without minding his surrounding. He did it because he wanted Brian and Yuko to save their strength as much as possible. Also, he did it because of the EXP he will receive from killing those monsters. The monsters were getting stronger the deeper they went in the desolate woods. But Souta wasn't bothered by this because he saw traces of battle here. From the looks of it, they were using magic and sword. It seems that the people who were after the mystical light cherry fought here. We're getting closer. Souta muttered. Closer? Brian looked at Souta asking what he meant by that. Closer to the dungeon. We will get a rare fruit there in the dungeon to complete the quest. Souta explained to Brian. Ah, I see. Brian nodded. Souta wiped the sweat on his forehead. He looked up at the sky. We should find some food for lunch. Ah. You're right, Souta. Now that you mention it. I notice that I'm hungry. Brian looked at his stomach and he caressed it. Yuko's ears twitched. She turned her head on her left side and growled angrily. Souta and Brian stopped talking when they heard her. What's wrong? Brian asked. Souta ignored him and he looked at Yuko. He jumped in the tree beside her and followed her line of sight. He then saw a girl with long green hair. The girl was wearing a white outfit that looks like a robe. Behind the girl was a group of people wearing a black hooded robe. The group of people was chasing after the girl. Is this some sort of encounter? Souta muttered. He didn't move and just observed the scene. He waited for a while to see if he would trigger a quest. After 5 seconds, Souta hasn't heard any prompt inside his head. Huh? Why? I don't want to bother myself if this wouldn't give me a quest. Souta sighed. Huh? That's a girl. Let's go save her, Souta. Souta turned his head and saw Brian beside him. Is Brian some kind of hero of justice? He thought while looking at Brian's face, which was filled with concern for the girl. Heis. Suit yourself. Souta sighed and said. He looked at Yuko and said, Yuko, go help her. Roar. Yuko roared loudly and it shook the trees around her. She then rushed towards the group of people wearing a black robe. Yosh. I couldn't turn away when I see someone in need. Brian said before he disappeared. I will just watch them. Souta said as he crossed his arms. He then leaned his back in the tree behind him and looked at them with an amused expression. The group of people including the girl stopped moving when they heard the roar of some wild monsters. A huge figure emerged from the trees. It was the wild red fur bear. The giant bear looked at them with fury in her eyes. The bear opened her mouth and once again roared loudly. Let's kill this bear quickly before we capture the girl. Okay. The group of people talked to each other. They agreed to rid the bear first before they capture the girl. They moved and surrounded the huge bear. Gur. Yuko rushed towards the person in front of her and waved her hand. What's happening? The girl was shaking. She subconsciously took a step back while looking at the huge bear that appeared. Chapter 56, Saving the Damsel. Yuko roared loudly as she charged towards the group of people wearing a black hooded robe. Let's kill this monster quickly. They quickly move around and surround Yuko. A dagger fell out of their sleeve and they grabbed it before attacking Yuko. Yuko grabbed a huge boulder on her side and threw it. Dodge. The hooded people quickly jumped sideways to avoid the boulder. Yuko saw them avoid the boulder. She turned around and faced the one behind her. She stepped forward and waved her hand towards the hooded man. The hooded man bent his body, barely avoiding her attack. That's close, he muttered while looking at Yuko warily. He understood that this red fur bear was strong and knew how to fight. Bombard it using magic, he shouted before he jumped backward. Yuko charged towards them, but they just avoided her, maintaining a distance away from her. Stop the monster for a second. 5 hooded people then charged and clashed with Yuko. While the 5 hooded people were exchanging blows with Yuko, the other 5 from the back cast their magic spell. But before they threw their spells at Yuko, Brian appeared with flames coating his fist. Brian threw his punch towards them. These people are quite strong, Souta muttered while looking at the people who were exchanging blows at Yuko. Even he wouldn't dare to take Yuko's blow head on. Her strength wasn't something he could ignore. Don't tell me they are nobles from Melosa country, Souta said. He heard from the adventurers in the guild that nobles from Melosa country came here for the mystical light cherry. These troublesome nobles. Souta sighed. He too was killed by the army of those nobles back in the game when he was doing a quest concerning them. That's why right now, he doesn't have a plan to solo all the quest. He planned to build a team and train them to avoid getting killed. He knew clearly how dangerous the quest that he will take in the future. While taking those difficult quests he died at least once. I will take you, Brian said, and his mana flared up. He moved his hands and cast the magic spell. Lightning Edge. Lightning crackled and it formed like a blade at the side of both of his wrist. Lightning Boots. He cast another spell. Lightning crackled around his feet. Okay, let's do this. Brian smiled and charged towards the group of hooded people. Wadash, the group of hooded people was shocked. They found that Brian was already gone. They slowly turned their head behind them and saw that Brian was already standing there with his back towards them. Crackle. Suddenly, they felt pain all over their body. AHH. They groaned as they found that they couldn't move at all. Their consciousness was fading slowly as their vision began to blur. They gritted their teeth and was preparing to attack Brian, but he was already gone. They screamed as they fell down and lose consciousness. Lightning Boots. Souta muttered in a low voice. This spell was more effective in raising the agility and dexterity attribute than his agility boost spell. He could see it that those people could barely react to Brian's speed. This was the first time he saw Brian used a magic spell. Brian always used combat arts before, so Souta doesn't have any idea what type of mage Brian is. Lightning Edge also wasn't an ordinary spell. It's a powerful spell that has high damage and could paralyze the target. It was perfect for subduing the targets alive. It seems that Brian is going to the path of battle mage. He patted his clothes and walked towards Brian. Brian looked at the green-haired girl that looks like 13 years old girl. He smiled and asked, "Are you okay?" The green-haired girl didn't know what to say. Brian turned his head and looked at Yuko. It seems that she was done in her business too. He turned back his head to the green-haired girl. Brian smiled gently and said, "Don't worry, I won't harm you. I'm just here to help you." Why? A simple question escaped out of the green-haired girl's mouth. I say, do I need a reason to help other people? Brian said gently. Cough. Cough. Souta coughed when he heard those cringy words. Those words made him shiver. What the hell? Is he some kind of real-life hero? He thought. Brian turned his head and saw Souta. What's wrong, Souta? Did you catch a cold here? He asked when he saw him coughing. And nothing. Souta shook his head. He then focused his attention on the green-haired girl. He narrowed his eyes while looking at her green-color pupils. The green-haired girl subconsciously took a step back. Oi Souta. Don't scare her, Brian said to Souta when he saw the green-haired girl getting scared. You're too kind. Souta sighed and he turned around. He saw that Yuko was already behind him. He reached out his hand and patted her head. Good job, Yuko. Brian squatted down and asked the girl. How many people are chasing after you? The green-haired girl shook her head. Souta joined them. Then, why are they chasing after you? The girl lowered her head as she didn't dare to meet his eyes. Souta narrowed his eyes. It seems that the girl knew why those people were after her. She just doesn't want to answer him as there was a chance that he will get involved in her affairs. I smell a secret quest from this girl. Okay, there's value in keeping her. Souta rubbed his chin and grinned. Stop Souta. Brian stopped Souta and he patted the girl's head and said, Don't worry, if you don't want to tell us then we will not force you. Well. Souta shrugged his shoulder. He then looked around and said, Let's go now. Okay. Brian nodded his head. He then asked the girl. Do you want to come with us? Don't worry, we will protect you. I promise I will not harm you, Souta said from the side. He decided that it's worth keeping her beside him. Oh okay. The girl nodded meekly. Yosh. Let's go now. Brian said as he raised his fist above his head. Yuko, let's go. Souta said as he started to walk. Brian, Yuko, and the green-haired girl followed him. Souta stopped after walking for a few minutes. What's wrong, Souta? Brian asked him. Souta glanced at him and said, I forgot something. Wait for me here. Huh? Brian looked at him with a confused expression. The green-haired girl also looked up at him. Souta ignored them and he patted Yuko's soft and fluffy fur. Yuko, stay here for a while. Mew. Yuko looked at him meekly. Okay, I will go now. Souta smiled and said. He then jumped in the tree. Wait, Souta. Where are you going? Brian shouted. Wait for me here. Souta's words echoed as he disappeared. Geez. That's Souta. Brian complained. He looked at the girl and Yuko. I guess we will wait here for a while. The group of hooded people slowly regained their consciousness. Ouch. My head hurts. That girl managed to escape. We need to find her or else the boss will. They complained as they felt the pain on their body. They couldn't even move properly with their condition. They recalled what happened before and cursed the one who helped the girl. That F.U.C.K.I.N.G tamer. Why did he help that girl? They thought that Brian was the tamer. He didn't saw Souta before, so they thought that Brian was the master of the red fur bear. Suddenly, their shadows shot upwards and bind their bodies. What the hell is this? F.U.C.K. Darkness element spell, shadow bind. What's that? A spell perfect for binding. We're done. Ha ha ha, we're going to die. Various exclamations sounded as they tried everything they've got to free themselves from the shadows. Tack. 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 A sound of footsteps echoed, causing them to stop moving. They turned their heads, but the shadows moved and prevent them from seeing the person's face. They could only see the lower body of the approaching person. They don't have any idea about who it is. Who's that? One person got a courage and asked while stuttering. That doesn't matter. I want to ask you some questions, so you better answer me honestly. The person said in a monotonous tone. From the tone of the voice, they guessed that this was a man. They kept their mouth shut. If you're going to keep quiet, then let me do this. The man grabbed his sword and swung it towards the person near him. A head of a person flew in the sky. The headless body spurted out blood like a fountain. The people beside him opened their eyes widely. They looked at the headless body of their comrades with wide eyes. Fear started to seep deep in their soul. Gulp. They subconsciously gulped, and when they were about to turn their heads towards the man, the shadows that were binding them tightened around their body. Okay, I will ask a question, so think carefully before you answer. The person's voice was cold that it made them shuddered in fear. Why are you chasing that green-haired girl? Chapter 57, Interrogation. Why are you after that green-haired girl? Souta asked the hooded people in a cold tone. And no. One of the hooded people shouted. Suddenly, a red line appeared in the center of his body. Slowly, his body split into two. He had a surprised expression as he drew his last breath. The whole place turned quiet once again. All the people looked at their comrades with a mixed expression. Souta looked at them with cold eyes. He could see none of them died when Brian saved the girl. Brian was an honest and straightforward man. Souta doesn't think that Brian would intentionally kill someone, so he has to clean up this mess as these people saw Brian's face and Yuko. I'll ask once again. Why are you chasing after the girl? Souta repeated his question. The people only lowered their heads and looked on the ground. After a few moments, one of them opened his mouth and said, Our boss will kill us if we tell you. Souta frowned and he once again waved his sword. This time he killed two people at the same time. Their heads shot up in the air and landed on the ground, spewing blood all over the place. Me too. Souta said, and he turned his head to the remaining hooded people. He approached them as he tightened his grip on his sword. He then slowly raised it and swung it. This time he didn't kill them. He just sliced their limbs apart so that they wouldn't think of escaping here. Also, the shadow bind spell was going to disappear soon. It hurts. Help me. They groaned as they tried to move their body. They felt all kinds of pain, but still, their lips were tightly shut. They didn't tell Souta anything no matter how many times he asked. Souta looked in the sky and said, Okay, we're running out of time. He then smiled at them. Do you know what that means? Souta charged towards them with a cold grin on his face. Still not giving up. Souta muttered while looking at the piled of corpses around him. He slowly turned his head and looked at the remaining two people. The two people wanted to run away when they saw him look at them. Their face contorted due to what they just saw. They don't think that they will survive this time. Souta deliberately left the two of them alive. It was because he wanted to extract information by torturing them. He lifted up his feet and walked towards one of them. The hooded man struggled to move his body. "Ahh. Don't come here." Souta lifted up his sword and stabbed the man's body. It was an ordinary stab. He didn't use the skill stab as it could kill the man in front of him. He also deliberately missed the man's vital parts. Arg! The man screamed at the top of his lungs. The pain he felt was extreme to the point that he just wanted to die. Souta stabbed and twisted his sword in the man's body, causing a loud scream to escape out of the man's mouth. After a few minutes, Souta stopped. He turned his head to the other one and asked, "Do you want to tell me? I can let you live if you tell me what you know. I know that you will still kill me even if I tell you." The man replied while stuttering. I see, then how about this?" Souta paused for a moment before he grinned and asked, "Do you want me to torture you or not? I will bring you to my house and will torture you every day until you collapse, then heal you before I repeated it." The man was terrified by what he heard. "Why, you're a monster?" Souta smiled and said, "Yeah, I'm a monster. I mean it, literally." The man opened his mouth widely. He couldn't process what just Souta said. In the end, the man submitted to Souta. He opened his mouth and said, "Okay, I will do what you want." "Good." Souta nodded and he swung his sword to kill the other man alive. He doesn't need to keep the other man alive anymore. Souta then placed his sword back in the scabbard before he focused on the remaining hooded person. "Why are you after that girl?" I don't know many things as the boss hid a lot of things from us." "I understand." Souta nodded. "That girl's name is CL.U.S.Ter. She came from one of the 3 great countries, the True God's Holy Kingdom." The man paused when he saw Souta contemplated. "True God's Holy Kingdom." Souta rubbed his chin. He didn't think that he would make contact with one of the 3 great countries this early. The 3 great countries was one of the reasons why the gods from the Gods continent haven't invaded the Giza continent. The Pope of the True God's Holy Kingdom, the Emperor of the Red Crystal Empire, and the leader of the Purple Cloud Dynasty were powerful enough to match Zeus, Odin, Susanoo, Shiva, Lug, Ra, etc. from the Gods continent. The 3 great countries were the pillar of the whole Giza continent, and in the future, the mechanic country would join their ranks. To think that girl came from one of the most powerful countries on the whole continent. She must be hiding some sort of secret of the True God's Holy Kingdom. That must be why these people were after her. Souta nodded and said, "You can continue." The boss said that he wants something from her. CL.U.S.Ter is hiding something the boss wants, but I don't know what it is. The man said while looking on the ground. "What's your boss's name?" Souta asked. He tried to recall the organization against the True God's Holy Kingdom. There were many organizations that were trying to put down the 3 great countries, but if he knew the leader then he would be able to know the power of the organization that was after the girl. "Cordova, that's the name of our leader." The man replied. "Cordova? Are you sure that it's Cordova?" Souta asked. "Yeah." The man nodded. Souta was surprised as he doesn't recall any NPC that has the name Cordova back in the game. It means that it's not that powerful organization. No, this was not a game anymore. There were many unknown factors that he didn't know in this world. "What's your aim?" Souta asked. The boss wanted to bring down the True God's Holy Kingdom. The man replied. Souta already guessed their motives, so it's not that surprising. Nonetheless, to bring down the True God's Holy Kingdom was not something that could easily be achieved. Supposedly, they have a plan and the girl called CL.U.S.Ter was connected to that plan. Really? This must be a hidden quest and Souta must trigger it no matter what happens. "I will ask one last question," Souta said. "Tell me the formation and secret of your organization." "Our base is hidden in the mountain between the Molosa country and the Barbarian Kingdom. We have our boss and our 7 executives are the core of our group. Our boss and the 7 executives are powerful individuals." The man explained the details of their organization to Souta. Souta listened to the man without saying anything. He finally understood the power of their organization. Their organization wasn't that powerful as it was only a small size group. They only have 100 people in their group, but their ambition was so high. They think that they could bring down one of the 3 great countries with only 100 people. Souta guessed the reason why they have such confidence was because of the girl. Although, they were only a small size organization, Souta guessed that the boss and the 7 executives were powerful enough to go against the True God's Holy Kingdom. "Okay, I understand, you can rest now." Souta paused for a moment and asked, "Do you have any last words?" "Huh? Last words?" The man looked at him with a dumbfounded expression. He then took out something from his robe and gave it to Souta. Souta received the item and saw that it was an ordinary necklace. The necklace has a pendant with a picture within it. The man, a woman, and a girl were smiling in the picture. "This?" Souta looked at the man with a questioning gaze. "Find the girl in the picture and gave her the necklace." She's my good daughter. Tell her that I love her. The man said. Souta stopped for a moment as he heard a familiar sound in his mind. Quest triggered. Find the girl in the picture and gave her the necklace. Rewards, 20,000 EXP, 5 free attribute points, and 3 skill points. Oi, 3 skill points for this quest. Souta was surprised. He took a deep breath to calm himself. He looked at the man and asked, okay, I've decided that I will not kill you. I'm in a good mood today. No, I already told you the secret of our organization, so the curse is already spreading in my body. The man shook his head. I see. Souta nodded in understanding. The man had a curse in his body. Once he told someone the secret of their organizations, the curse will spread in his body and kill him. Can you tell me where is your daughter? Souta asked. The man shook his head and said, I don't know where she is. My family suffered from the suppression of the true God's holy kingdom. My wife died and my daughter disappeared. I don't know if she's still alive, but I have a feeling that she's really alive. I see. Don't worry about it, your daughter is alive. I will find her. Souta said as he placed the necklace inside his pocket. Since he received the quest to find his daughter was still alive. Kill me now. The man said. His face was already pale due to the curse. I understand. Souta nodded and he raised his sword above him before he swung it down. I hope you don't forget your promise. The man said as the sword separated his head from his body. Hiss. This ending really leaves a bad taste in my mouth. I shouldn't have asked about that. Souta sighed and looked in the sky. Chapter 58, The Great War. Sorry, it took longer than it needed. Souta apologized to Brian after he came back. He cleaned the blood stain on his body. That's the reason why he took a long time. I'm curious. What did you do? Brian asked Souta with a curious expression. It's not that worth mentioning. Souta waved his hand and walked beside Yuko. He stretched out his hand and patted her head. So where should we go, Souta? Brian asked. Souta was the only one who knew their exact goals, so he needed to depend on him. We will go back to the village and come back this night, Souta said. Huh? Brian exclaimed. What's wrong? Souta asked him when he heard Brian's loud voice. Why? Brian said one word. He was asking why they should go back to the village. I said before that we will scout this area first, Souta said as he shrugged his shoulders. The girl called CL.U.S.Ter just looked at their interactions. She didn't know why, but she felt afraid of Brian and Souta. She didn't know why, but she felt a powerful presence behind the two. It was especially towards Brian. Souta noticed her looking at Brian with slight fear in her eyes. Although it was just a second, it didn't escape his eyes. Oi, what's your name? Souta asked the girl. He asked her name to avoid suspicion in case he blurted out her name. CL.U.S.Ter. The girl replied in a low voice. Oh. So your name's CL.U.S.Ter, huh? You don't need to worry now, I will protect you. Brian said as he patted his chest. Thank you for saving me. CL.U.S.Ter hesitated for a while before she bowed her head and thanked Brian and Souta. CL.U.S.Ter, huh? It felt familiar to me. Souta thought while looking at her. He smiled at her and said, My name's Souta Ishii and this guy is Brian Dagruel, a comrade of mine. Brian smiled and patted his chest proudly. Something caught CL.U.S.Ter's attention in Souta's words. She tilted her head and said, From Ishii clan. Ishii clan? What's that? Souta asked her when he heard her mentioned Ishii clan. It was the first time he heard a clan in this world that has the same surname as his. They are a family with the power to see the future. CL.U.S.Ter lowered her head and said in a tiny voice. I see. Souta nodded in understanding. It was the first time he heard that someone has the power to see the future in this world. Even in the game, he hasn't heard it at all. Especially, the Ishii clan. He looked at her and asked, So where are they? CL.U.S.Ter shook her head and said, They are an ancient family and some people said that they all died in the Great War. So that's why I didn't know about the Ishii clan. Souta thought. The happenings in the Great War was still a mystery even to him. He only knew little details about it. Where did you learn about that? Souta asked. In the place where I lived. There's a lot of books there and I don't have anything to do, so I kept reading books. CL.U.S.Ter replied to him. Souta guessed that it was the books from the true God's holy kingdom. It's within his expectations that the three great countries have some records of the Great War. After all, they were founded for a few thousand years ago. Souta squatted down and asked, Can you tell me more about the Great War later? I'm curious about what happened in that war. Okay. CL.U.S.Ter nodded. This girl really has some value. Souta smiled contently. Souta's group including CL.U.S.Ter went back to the village. They met some monsters on their way out but Souta and Brian eliminated it. They successfully got out of the forest without having any problem. The group was walking in the market looking for something valuable. What should we do now, Souta? Brian asked Souta with a bored expression. Rest, Souta replied while checking the fruits that were on the stall. Rest. Brian couldn't believe what he heard. Yeah, rest. Souta nodded and he bought the fruits that he picked. It's important for an adventurer to be cautious. It's also important if your energy is full. Yeah. Brian dropped his shoulders. He was clearly bored and was itching for some action. Heis. You really don't get it? Souta picked up the fruit he bought from the plastic bag and placed it close to Yuko's mouth. Yuko looked at the fruit for a moment before she opened her mouth and bit the fruit. She ate the fruit in just a second, so she looked at Souta and opened her mouth as if she was asking him to feed her. Here. Souta picked another fruit from the plastic bag and put it inside her mouth. Mew. Yuko happily ate the fruit that he gave her. Brian looked at him and Yuko back and forth. Sucks to be you. Then, an idea came into his mind. Ah. I know. Maybe I will tame a monster myself and raise it to become the strongest. Ha ha ha. Souta looked at Brian with a dumbfounded expression. Oi, how did you come to that conclusion? I saw how Yuko fought, so I think I should tame some monster for myself. Then, I'll become a tamer too. Brian laughed. Do what you want. I'll tell you that it's not easy to raise a pet. Souta said and he continued to feed Yuko the fruits that he bought. Souta's group went back to the inn. They rent another room for CL.U.S.Ter. She's a girl so Souta thought that it's not a good idea to let her stay with him or Brian. Brian rested in his room while Souta called CL.U.S.Ter to come into his room. CL.U.S.Ter came in his room and Souta asked her about the Great War. CL.U.S.Ter told him everything she knew about the Great War. Her knowledge about the Great War was limited but this was enough for Souta. 20,000 years ago, the demons tried to destroy the world. Various races joined hands to repel the demons. It was said that the technology of ancient civilization was more advanced than the current technology in the current era. They have different powerful weapons and the people from ancient times knew how to create the universal-grade equipment. They also have connections to many different worlds. They used that force to push back the demons from the edges of the world. That's the normal story of the Great War which was passed down through generations. But from CL.U.S.Ter, the story was quite different. The demons were searching for something, that's why they launched an invasion. They were looking for a door, an entrance to a different realm. It was because they said that the world, no, the whole cosmos was going to end soon. The Ishi clan also said that the world was going to end in the near future. Of course, the other races didn't let the demons roam in their territory, so they forced back the demons. Then, something entirely different appeared all of a sudden. It caused chaos in the whole cosmos. They thought that the end was coming, so the demons joined hands with other races. CL.U.S.Ter didn't have much information about this part, so her description was vague. But Souta understood that all the forces of the whole cosmos suffered great casualties. The Ishi clan disappeared, the founding gods of the gods continent died, the supreme dragon god died, the Vajra race was annihilated, powerful leaders of humans and elves died, and also the progenitors of different monsters died. Souta was shocked when he heard this. All those powerful existence died from unknown existence that came out of nowhere. He was curious about what really happened that day. Really? This world is getting interesting. There's really a lot of things that I haven't know in this world. Souta's mouth cracked into a smile. He looked at CL.U.S.Ter and said, you can rest now. Thanks for telling me this. No, you saved me so it's natural that I help you. CL.U.S.Ter shook her head. She then hurriedly left his room. Souta looked at her retreating back before he lay down on his bed. After fulfilling the requirements of his next evolution, he would try to acquire more combat arts so that he could level it up to 2 in his next evolution. He rested for a few hours before he got up and went to Brian's room. Brian, we're going to depart now. Prepare yourself, we're going deep in the desolate forest. Souta said. Okay. Brian replied in a loud voice. Souta then went to CL.U.S.Ter and said the same thing. In just a few minutes, Souta, Brian, and CL.U.S.Ter went out of the inn to fetch Yuko. The group departed and went to the desolate woods. The sky was dark and the night breeze was cold. Soon, they were going to meet a lot of people after the mystical light cherry. It seemed that it's going to get chaotic in the desolate woods tonight. Chapter 59, Commandments. Souta brought CL.U.S.Ter with him. He was afraid that she would run away once he left her in the village. He wouldn't let a valuable person like her leave easily. He would squeeze some benefits out of her before he let her go. Souta's group arrived in the inner part of the desolate woods. The trees around this part were 10 to 20 meters tall, and all of the trees had brown and gray color leaves. It made them look like withered trees, but this was its natural color. This was the reason why this forest was called desolate woods. The atmosphere is different than the outer part of the woods, Souta muttered while looking around his surroundings. Whoa! This is the first time I see this kind of tree. Brian exclaimed while looking around the trees in wonder. CL.U.S.Ter was also looking around quietly. It seemed that she was still holding back in front of Brian and Souta. She didn't want them to think badly of her. What's with this forest, Souta? Brian asked Souta. This forest is called Desolate Woods. A lot of powerful monsters inhabited this forest, but the most dangerous was the giant Nova boa and the mountain-back crocodile. Souta paused as he turned his head and looked at Brian. These two monsters were the overlord of this forest. If we somehow meet these two monsters, then we have to run as fast as we can. With our current strength, we would not be able to defeat it, because these two monsters are monsters that already created its monster orb. In other words, these two are powerful enough to crash the four of us with the use of best Faram. What is a monster orb? Brian asked with a curious expression. Huh? Souta looked at Brian with wide eyes. He couldn't believe that Brian didn't know the monster orb at all. He couldn't help but sigh at Brian's ignorance. Monster orb is the core of a powerful monster. It is also the source of strength of the monster and the reason why the monsters are powerful. The monster orb can be fetched at a high price in the market. It can be sold by 100,000 platinum coins. The energy inside the monster orb is more potent than the energy inside the mana stone and essence. He patiently explained the monster orb to Brian. Do you know the light in Ladro City? Yeah. Brian nodded. The reason why those bulbs across the street light up are because of the monster orb. One monster orb is needed to light up all the lights in the whole city for 1 week. If a person would monopolize a single monster orb, then it would take a few months, even a year, before that person consumed all the energy inside the monster orb. Souta explained to Brian. The monster orb was also the reason why the human and Demi hunted down the monsters. I see. Brian nodded. I can't believe you didn't even know this. Souta sighed. Souta's group walked for a few dozen minutes before they met some monster. The monster was a carnivorous plant. The plant was 3 meters tall. It was a powerful monster, but with Souta and Brian, it didn't look like one. All the monsters that they met all died by the teamwork of Souta, Brian, and Yuko. The trees became twisted like everything around them was changing. The area around them was completely covered in brush and branches. Souta asked Brian to clean the area. We will rest here for 5 minutes. Souta picked up a decent place to rest. Of course, he scouted the area within it before he settled with this place. Souta's group sat down and they leaned their back on the trees. This is such a weird forest, Brian said in a low voice. Souta ignored Brian and he looked at CL.U.S.Ter. He noticed that she wasn't gasping or out of breath. It seems like she really holds some power inside her. There's also a possibility that she didn't know about this power and only those higher up of the true God's holy kingdom knew. Souta shook his head and put his hand inside his bag. He took out fruit and bit it. This is good, Souta said as he looked at the fruit that looks like an apple on his palm. Gilug gilug. He heard a sound beside him, so he turned his head and saw Yuko was looking at the fruit on his hand with drool on her face. Really? Souta smiled wryly and he took out another fruit for her. Yuko swallowed the fruit with a happy expression. Looking at her expression, Souta smiled and patted her head. After a few minutes, they packed their things and began to move forward. They trekked towards the eastern part of the inner woods. The surroundings were dark, so their pace was quite slow. While they were walking, they heard a sound of metal clashing against each other. Yuko's ears twitched as she looked at the direction where the sound came from. That's the sound of fighting, Souta muttered. Then, he turned his head and looked at Brian and CL.U.S.Ter. Don't make any noise. We're going to check it? Okay, Brian replied. CL.U.S.Ter just nodded her head. Good. Follow me. Souta nodded in satisfaction at their reply. He walked slowly towards the sound. Souta's group saw 30 people battling each other. Those people were powerful, especially the 2 people who were fighting in the center. Both of them were wearing a full plate of silver-colored armor. The only difference was the symbol that was engraved in their chest. The symbol in their chest indicated that they were the knights of the nobles. The symbol represented the family they supported. Souta turned his head and looked at his group. He slowly opened his mouth and said, a lot of people were going to fight in this place, so we better avoid them. This time we only came to check the strength of each group, but we can see from their force that we wouldn't stand a chance if we fought them head-on. Also, their numbers were greater than us. Yeah, they are strong. I wanted to fight them. Brian said while looking at the people who were fighting against each other. Don't worry about it, you will get a chance to fight later, Souta assured Brian. It's true that Brian would have a chance to fight later in the dungeon they were heading. Let's go now, Souta said. The group turned around and quietly left the area, but they didn't know that a figure was hiding in the trees was looking at them. Somewhere in the forest, two people wearing a black robe were walking leisurely. Their black robe wasn't an ordinary robe. The robe looks like the one that those priests from the church wear. The robe had red linings and a symbol of a hand holding the world was imprinted in the back. Behind them were the corpses of various monsters. Ah, poor little monsters. You sacrifice your lives for the greater goods of people. Oh, God. Please guide these monsters towards the paradise. A man with long blonde hair said. The man has red pupils and part of his bangs covered his left eyes. He had a tattoo of red arrow pointing downwards below his left eye, and below that arrow was the love word written in cursive form. The man was looking at the corpses of the monsters with intoxicated expression. The other figure was a woman. She has long black hair that was tied in a ponytail. Her skin was pale and her pupils were crimson in color. She looked at the man with annoyance and said, "Stop that. We just kill them because they attack us, that's all. We wouldn't even bother them if they didn't attack us." What are you saying, Carmilla? All the things here were created by the Supreme Creator, so it's natural that we show them our love. The man said. Heis. I shouldn't have partnered with you in this mission. The woman called Carmilla sighed. She then stopped moving and turned her head on her left side. What's wrong, Carmilla? The man asked when he saw her strange expression. A group of people is coming, Carmilla said. The man also turned his head and saw more than 20 people came out of the bushes. The people were wearing a full plate armor indicating that they were knights of a noble household. Carmilla and the man looked at the knights with a curious expression. A young man in his 20s stepped forward and looked at the two with arrogance. He was wearing luxury clothes for nobles. He was the master of the knights. I'm Ranson de Roujon, the third son of the Roujon family. The young man introduced himself. He looked down at the two and ordered them. You two, tell me who you are and why you are here. Carmilla and the man looked at each other. I'm asking you. Don't you know me? I'm the son of Jasvin de Roujon. I'm a noble lineage, so don't you dare ignore me. Are you also here because of the mystical light cherry? Ranson grew angrier when he saw the two people in front of him ignored him. Carmilla laughed at his words. She opened her mouth and said, Mystical light cherry? We're not here for something as low as that fruit. We have hundreds of that in our base. You. How dare you? Drag. He raised his voice and called his most powerful knight. Young master. We should not drag said, but Ranson interrupted him. He wanted to tell what type of monsters were behind the two unknown people. The corpses of the monster behind the two weren't ordinary at all. Every corpse of monsters was a powerful one that could even give him, a knight, some trouble. I'm your master, so you should just follow my instruction without saying anything. Ranson said. Yes, young master. Drag bowed and pulled out his sword. The rest of the knights also pulled out their swords. They pointed their sword at the two people. Now tell me, who you are and what's your goal here. Hansen looked at the two people with a smirk. Fine, I'm going to tell you. After all, I never told a lie before. Carmilla stepped forward. Her mouth curved into a smile. Commandments of the God's words. Representing the truth commands, Carmilla Ribentadors. And I'm Julius Reinhar, representing the love of the Supreme God. The man opened his arms widely as he turned his head to look in the sky. We're here to retrieve the corpse of a god. Carmilla smiled at them with a gentle expression. What? Everyone was shocked when they heard their introduction. They subconsciously took a step back. Fear started to appear in their hearts. Their grips on their weapon loosened and it fell on the ground. If Souta was here, he too would be shocked. It was because the God's will was currently in the desolate woods. If someone said the God's will cult, then the priest of the true God's holy kingdom would burn those people. The true God's holy kingdom target among the three bringer of calamity group was the God's will cult. The people from the true God's holy kingdom despised the God's will cult. It was because of the inhumane things that God's will did, saying that it was for the supreme God. God's will was one of the three bringers of calamity. They were called like that because every time they appeared in public something bad happens. It was either annihilating a country or causing a strange phenomenon in the world. If the three great countries were the good camp, then the three bringers of calamity was the evil camp. The commandments, the deadly sins, and the zodiacs were the most powerful terrorist group that could go toe-to-toe to the three great countries. The commandments of the God's will were active in both Giza and God's continent, while the deadly sins were active in the God's continent. Lastly, the zodiacs were active in the Giza continent. Each of them was a powerhouse of their own that could even bring down a god. Souta stopped and looked in the starry sky. I sense something terrible. What's wrong, Souta? Brian asked him when he saw Souta stop. Nothing. Souta shook his head. Chapter 60, Meeting Lamilia. And no. Ranson, the young noble, looked at Carmilla and Julius with fear in his eyes. He fell down on his back as he kept repeating the same word. There's not a hint of arrogance in his presence enemy, it was instead replaced by fear. Beside him were the corpses of his proud knights. All the powerful-looking knights were now lying on the pool of blood without any signs of life. Ah God! Please forgive these sinful people. The Supreme God loves all the creatures equally. Julius said as he put his palm together and looked in the starry sky. Tisk. Don't mind that idiot. Carmilla clicked her tongue while looking at Julius in annoyance. Do you know that we wouldn't even bother insects like you if you didn't attack us? It's all your fault that your knights died and also your fault that you will die. Anyone who goes against the Supreme God will die. And going against us is equivalent to that, so it means that no matter what you say today I will not let you live. No, please forgive me. I will do anything that you want. Just don't kill me. Ranson pressed his forehead on the ground as he begged Carmilla to spare him. Actually, I can see it in your eyes before that you have the intention to kill us. You can't hide those things to us, the representatives of the gods will, as we are sensitive to any malicious things. Carmilla slowly walked towards Ranson. If you didn't show that intent to kill, maybe your knights were still alive right now. Please, I will not do it again. Ranson begged for his life until the end. Tears and snots were flowing down on his face. There's not a hint of noble demeanor in his presence. Goodbye, and may God guide your poor soul, Carmilla said as she raised her hand and her nails grew sharper. She swung it down on Ranson's neck. Souta's group was heading towards the dungeon in the eastern part of the inner woods. While they were walking, Souta noticed that Yuko's ears kept twitching. He carefully glanced at his surroundings and noticed that someone was following them behind. That person was silently following them above the trees. Souta looked at Brian and CL.U.S.Ter before he said, Brian, CL.U.S.Ter. Someone is following us. Brian was about asked when Souta interrupted him. Don't shout or else that person will notice that we knew about its presence, Souta said as he narrowed his eyes at Brian. Oh okay. Brian nodded at him. Suddenly, the person that was following him disappeared. It seems that he already left. Souta said while looking at the position of that person before she disappeared. That person is already gone. Brian looked surprised. Yeah, maybe that individual noticed our strange behavior. No, it should be your strange behavior, Brian. Souta said. Why? You shouldn't look at that person's location repeatedly as it will give that person our plan. Souta explained to Brian. Okay, I get it now. Brian nodded. Souta then looked at CL.U.S.Ter and asked, do you know how to fight? CL.U.S.Ter shook her head in denial. I understand. Don't worry, if something happens Brian will protect you. Souta said as he assured her. CL.U.S.Ter was physically fitted. Her stats were quite high, but the only problem was that she doesn't know how to defend herself, that's why she could only run when those people chased her before. CL.U.S.Ter meekly nodded her head. It seems that she was ashamed that she couldn't even protect herself. Okay, let's continue. Souta's group continued to walk deeper through the desolate woods. Here in the inner parts of the Desolation Woods, battling was present everywhere. Souta's group sometimes felt the ground shook and sometimes they could hear a loud explosion. Souta's group arrived in the river. They walked towards it, but Souta felt someone appeared behind them. Souta glanced at Brian and CL.U.S.Ter. It looks like these two didn't felt the presence of that person. He then looked at Yuko and saw that she was aware of that person. Let's go. Souta took a deep breath and grabbed the handle of his sword. He quickly pulled out his sword before he turned around and threw it towards the location of that person. At the same time, Souta saw the face of that person. It was a middle-aged man with short white hair and a white mustache. He was wearing the clothes of a butler. The Vajra sword quickly tore the air as it went flying straight to that middle-aged man. Wadash, the middle-aged man revealed a surprised expression. He quickly pulled out the sword that was hanging on his waist and parried the Vajra sword. Souta bent down his knees and charged straight while using agility boost and dash at the same time. He then jumped in the air when he was close to his sword and grabbed it. In the mid-air, Souta threw the skill stab towards the middle-aged man. He wouldn't let this middle-aged man escape. The middle-aged man was shocked as he couldn't even move because Souta was blocking all his escape routes. Tug. Souta landed in front of the middle-aged man and pierced his palm on the tree using the Vajra sword. Arg. The middle-aged man groaned and his weapon fell on the ground. I got careless. He said while looking at Souta's face. Fred. A girl appeared behind them. She raised her sword and pointed it at Souta. Release Fred and I will forget about this. Souta turned his head and looked at her. If this middle-aged man was a butler, then this girl was a maid. The maid has long blonde hair that was tied in a bun. Souta. Brian, CL.U.S.Ter, and Yuko approached Souta. They were surprised when they saw him suddenly attack someone. What happened? Brian asked while looking at Souta and the middle-aged man back and forth. This man was the one following us, Souta said as he looked at the middle-aged man in the eyes. He gripped his sword tightly and twisted it. Arg. The middle-aged man screamed when Souta twisted the sword that pierced his palm. You. Release him. The girl shouted at Souta. Release? Don't make me laugh. You don't have the right in your current situation. Souta sneered at her. You should understand your current situation first. If you continue to show that kind of attitude in front of me, then I will kill this man. The girl didn't know what to say. In the end, you're just all talk, Souta said as he twisted his sword. What happened here, Fred? Jasmine. A feminine voice sounded behind them. You. Brian exclaimed when he saw the person who just arrived here. Souta grew curious, so he turned his head and saw that person. That person was a petite girl with shoulder-length blue hair and blue-color pupils. She has thick long blue tails sticking out in her back. She's Souta's classmate, Lumilia Vanis, also the class representative of Mage Class 1B. What are you doing here, class rep? Brian asked Lumilia with a curious expression. He didn't even hesitate when he asked her. Souta? Brian? Why are the two of you here? Lumilia asked the same question. We're adventurers, so we both doing a quest here. What about you? Brian replied. Souta didn't say anything and he just observed them. He could guess why Lumilia was here. It seems the rumor about the mystical light cherry reached the Ladro city. She was a noble, so it was natural that she would receive such information. Brian and Lumilia talked about why they were here. Then, their conversation shifted to CL.U.S.Ter. Brian explained to her how they met CL.U.S.Ter and saved her from those strange people. Lumilia observed CL.U.S.Ter's appearance when she heard that Souta and Brian saved her. Young miss. Fred said with slight hesitation. What is it, Fred? Lumilia turned to look at him. Do you know them? Fred asked. Yes, they are my classmates. Lumilia nodded her head. Then, can you please tell them to let go of me? Fred smiled wryly. After all, Souta's sword was still embedded in his palm. Souta heard him, so he looked at Lumilia and nodded. He pulled out his sword, causing blood to spurt out of Fred's palm. What really happened here? Lumilia asked Souta. There's someone following us, but that person suddenly disappeared. Then, I sensed that someone was behind us, so I quickly attacked that person. Souta said as he shrugged his shoulder. He's telling them that he couldn't help it? He sat down and sheathed his sword. He supported his head with his palm and said, Okay, in return to what I did to him, I will heal him. Lumilia looked at Souta and asked, Do you know healing spell? Yeah, just a simple light heal spell. Souta nodded at her. Okay, let me see your palm. Fred looked at Lumilia asking for confirmation. Lumilia nodded her head. Thanks. Fred smiled wryly as he stretched out his palm in front of Souta. It's okay. Souta shook his head and used light heal on his palm. Chapter 61, Lumilia's Quest. Souta used light heal on the palm of Fred. He stopped the bleeding of the wounds before he took out something from his bag. This was a potion to completely heal the wounds. His skill was only a basic heal skill. It couldn't completely heal any wounds, so to completely heal any wounds without leaving a scar, a potion was needed. No need. Fred shook his head as he declined the potion that Souta gave. We also have some potion. No need to use a potion in such shallow wounds. Okay. Souta nodded and he placed back the potion in his bag. So your name is CL.U.S.Ter. Lumilia looked at CL.U.S.Ter and asked while patting her head. Yes. CL.U.S.Ter nodded meekly. Where are your parents? Lumilia asked her in a gentle tone. CL.U.S.Ter replied by shaking her head. I see. I'm sorry for asking such question. It must be hard for you. Lumilia said as she gently caressed CL.U.S.Ter's head. Souta looked at Lumilia with a surprised expression. Her tone was different from the usual. She was always putting up a cold front and a strict tone, so it was surprising to see the side of her. He guessed that she was like that because she was seriously taking the responsibility of a class representative in the institute. Suddenly, a group of people appeared before them. Those people were wearing leather armor and pants. They were also armed with sharp weapons. They were bandits without a doubt. Souta just looked at these bandits without saying anything. In fact, He knew that a lot of people were coming in this direction, but he got distracted when he listened to Lumilia and CL.U.S.Ter's conversation. Brian, Yuko, Lumilia, Fred, Jasmine, and CL.U.S.Ter stopped moving. They turned their heads to look at the bandits. Lumilia glared at the bandits. Who are you? She opened her mouth and asked them in a cold tone completely different from the one she used on CL.U.S.Ter. The bandits looked at them with a grin on their face. They looked at them as if they were prey that fell in their traps. Oh. The leader of the bandits stepped forward and looked at Lumilia with lewd eyes. He didn't even bother hiding his desire. From the looks of it, you're a noble, right? What if I am? Lumilia replied in a cold tone. She placed her hand on the handle of her sword. We're finally going to enjoy some noble after a long time, boys. The leader said as he looked at Lumilia up and down. Boss. At least let me enjoy the maid first. Boss. That little girl, can you give her to me? I have a thing for little girl. The bandits said in a burst of laughter. They already think that the girls here were their property. Souta looked at the bandit leader and Lumilia. He doesn't know what got the bandit leader's interest in Lumilia. Is it a body? No, Lumilia's B.O.O.B.S were close to non-existence and she doesn't have that great curves. If Souta was to say it, Lumilia looks like a child, a lowly to be precise. Souta would prefer the maid over Lumilia. He could see the curves and those well-endowed chests of her through the maid outfit. He shook his head and removed those thoughts in his mind. He looked at Brian and thought that he should teach reality to him. Okay, I will show him how to handle a situation like this, so he wouldn't make any mistake again. Souta thought as he nodded to himself. Souta knew how Brian think, so he guessed that Brian would let these bandits go. Ah, how shallow. You started it? Brian said as his mana flared up. He clenched his fist gathering his mana around it. Otto, don't you see that you're at disadvantage here? We have numbers here. You can't hope to defeat us. The bandit leader said with an amused expression. We're going to slowly enjoy those girls, right boys? Yeah. This SCU.M. Jasmine gritted her teeth as she pulled out her sword. Stand back, young miss. I will protect you. Fred said as he stepped forward in front of Lumilia. You don't have to worry about me, Fred. I can protect myself. Lumilia said as she pulled out her sword. Umph. A sneer sounded. All of them looked at Souta, who stood up while patting his clothes. I'm grateful. Just like what the maid said before, you're just a low-life SCU.M. Souta looked at the bandits and slowly approached them. He stopped in front of the bandit leader. So. Brian, Yuko, CL.U.S.Ter, Lumilia, Fred, and Jasmine just followed Souta with their eyes. Huh. The bandit leader placed his hand on his ear as if he couldn't hear what Souta was saying. I will not have any second thoughts in killing you. The Vajra sword Saya in Souta's hand emitted a red aura. Cross moon. A red light flashed and everyone saw a red line in the body of the bandits. Thud. 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 Slowly their upper body fell down on the ground. The face of the bandits showed an expression of shock. It seems that they couldn't believe what happened to them. Spurt. The lower body spurted out fountains of blood in the mid-air. The whole area was dyed in a blood-red color. CL.U.S.Ter was terrified when she saw the bloody scene. She quickly turned around and covered her ears. Eik. Jasmine felt a little dizzy witnessing such a gore scene. She's just a maid that have knowledge about fighting, so she hadn't seen someone kill people like this. He's not an ordinary student. From his reaction, I could see that it's not his first time killing people. Fred narrowed his eyes as he looked fiercely at Souta. Lumilia subconsciously took a step back while she covered her mouth with her hands. After all, this were their first time seeing someone killed like this in front of them, so it's natural that they felt nausea because of the gore scene. Souta ignored them as sheathed the Vajra sword. It was his first time using the skill of his sword. It feels different from using the skill he learned. Souta closed his eyes and heard a sound in his mind. Finally, Souta reached level 19. Just one more level and he will reach the level requirement for the second evolution. Souta. Brian walked towards Souta and grabbed his collar. Souta looked at Brian with plain eyes. He saw that Brian was clearly angry at what he did to the bandits. Why? He asked in a plain tone. There's not a hint of emotion in his voice. Why did you kill them? Brian asked him in a loud voice. You know the reason why, Souta replied as he shook his body and fell on the ground. But. You don't have to kill them. Brian said as he gritted his teeth and clenched his fists tightly. Is that what you always do in your quest? When you met a bandit, did you always let them live? Souta said, stood up while patting his clothes. He turned to look at Brian's eyes and continued, you know that the bandits you let go before didn't stop in what they are doing. Because of you they killed and R.A.P.E more people, you know. But. Brian lowered his eyes. Souta narrowed his eyes when looking at Brian. He then sighed and shrugged his shoulder. Okay, let's go now. Brian's attitudes didn't really bother him. In fact, he actually liked it. This kind of attitude was the one that would lead him in getting more quest. Like before, if Brian didn't insist on helping CL.U.S.Ter, then Souta wouldn't know about the Great War. He's just testing if he could influence Brian easily. But it seems that's not necessary for him. Souta decided that he will do things in the shadows secretly. Souta turned to Lumilia and asked, "You class rep, what are you going to do?" Young miss, we should go now. This man is dangerous. I don't like that feeling. Jasmine whispered to Lumilia. Young miss, we should ask him for help. His strength would help us in a lot of ways. Fred whispered. Fred and Jasmine have different opinions. One was afraid of Souta because of what he did, while one thought of taking advantage of Souta's strength. Young miss. If we don't get it, you know what will the Lord say? Fred continued to persuade her. Lumilia frowned when she remembered her father, the family head of the Asver's noble family. She gritted her teeth and slowly opened her mouth. Souta. What is it? Souta titled his head with a confused expression. I want to ask you. If you can help us. Lumilia stuttered. She wasn't used in asking other people for help. Heis. Speak clearly. Souta sighed. Fred was the one who stepped forward and bowed his head. We request you if you can lend us your strength to get the mystical light cherry. Gathering, help Lumilia's group in acquiring the mystical light cherry. Rewards, 20,000 EXP, 10 free attribute points, 5 skill points. Chapter 62, Into the Dungeon. Souta was surprised when he received a quest. 5 skill points. Souta was surprised to see 5 skill points as rewards. The difficulty of this quest was clearly higher than all the quests that he did before. He turned his head and looked at Lumilia's group. He wondered if he should accept the quest or not. Accepting the quest means that he wouldn't acquire the mystical light cherry, but he would get 5 skill points. That's a lot of skill points. Okay, I'll help you, but first you have to help me first. Souta nodded at them and stated his condition. If he hadn't asked them anything in return, then they would grow suspicious of him. Thanks for accepting our selfish request, but I have a question, Fred said politely. Do tell me, Souta said in response to him. How should we help you? Fred asked carefully. We will enter the dungeon later and just protect CL.U.S.Ter. Souta said as he rubbed his chin. Is that all? Fred took a glance at CL.U.S.Ter and asked Souta. Yeah, Brian and I will become too busy in fighting, so we need someone to protect CL.U.S.Ter. Then, I'm curious about this red fur bear. Her. She's Yuko, my partner. Yuko, say hi to them. Mew. Souta turned his head and looked at Brian. Brian was looking on the ground while his fists clenched tightly. Souta approached him and patted his back. He said, Don't worry about it, I'm just testing you if you're going to change your perspective in life. But don't worry, that's okay, just do what you think is right. Souta left after he said those words to Brian. Yuko looked at Brian before she followed Souta. CL.U.S.Ter lifted up her head and looked at Yuko and Souta's back. Then, she turned her head and looked at Brian. Souta talked about the detailed information of the mystical light cherry to Lumilia. Souta, Lumilia, Fred, and Jasmine were around the map of the desolate woods. They were looking at the map with a serious expression. Where is the exact place of the fruit? Souta asked. We don't know the exact place, but the fruit was said to be seen in this part, Lumilia said as she drew a circle in small part of the northern woods. Souta looked at the map with a scrutinizing gaze. After a few moments, he opened his mouth and said, We should go around this part to avoid the nest titan hornets. We shouldn't use our energy in fighting these monsters, as we need to fight the other people that came here for the fruit. Other people? Lumilia looked at Souta. Huh? Do you think that you're the only one who came here for the fruit? There are people who came here with the same reason as you. They are competitors. We have to fight and defeat them if you want to get the mystical light cherry. Souta said in a cold tone. Yeah. Lumilia lowered her head and nodded. Souta guessed that Lumilia didn't know anything at all. She just came here because she heard about the mystical light cherry. She didn't even bring knights in her quest like the other nobles that came here. Souta sighed helplessly. It seems that Lumilia was innocent in outside world affairs. To think that the strict class rep didn't know this. It seems like he overestimated her. Okay, let's finish what we came here first, Souta said as he stood up. Thanks. Fred also stood up and thanked Souta. You can save your thanks after we get that fruit. Souta glanced at him and said before he left. Lumilia, Fred, and Jasmine looked at his back. Is he really your classmate? Young miss. Justin asked Lamilia in a low voice. Yeah, from what I see he's the strongest in our class. Lamilia nodded. Young miss, if I'm not wrong your class is mage class, am I right? Fred asked. Yes, we're from mage class. He showed a power not befitting any mage in our class. He even defeated the students from shield class without using any spells. Lamilia explained to them. The group walked for an hour before they arrived near in front of the waterfalls. Is this where the dungeon resides? Brian asked as he looked at the 40-meter tall falls. Yeah, it's behind that falls. Souta nodded as he observed Brian. It seems that Brian recovered now. His mental capacity was high and it looks like he experienced the same thing before. Souta doesn't know what Brian experienced before that made him like that. Brian seems bent on saving everyone that needs help. Souta looked at CL.U.S.Ter and said, CL.U.S.Ter, stay behind Lamilia. She will protect you. CL.U.S.Ter nodded her head and she stood beside Lamilia. Lamilia looked at CL.U.S.Ter and patted her head. Don't worry, I will protect you. Thank you. CL.U.S.Ter nodded meekly. Follow me, Souta said as he stepped forward and let the water fell on his body. The rest of the group followed Souta behind. Behind the waterfalls, they saw a wide cave. It was so wide that Yuko could move inside the cave freely. Everyone's clothes were wet because of the waterfalls. Brian looked around and saw Jasmine's bra through her maid outfit. When he saw her bra, he quickly turned around and looked deep in the dungeon. Souta noticed it so he looked at the girls and said, you should dry your clothes first. Brian couldn't even concentrate when you're showing such things to him. Lamilia, CL.U.S.Ter, and Jasmine looked at their body and saw that their wet clothes were sticking close in their body. Young miss. Fred exclaimed as he removed his coat and placed it on Lamilia. Thank you, Fred. Lamilia said with a hint of redness in her cheeks as she glanced at Brian and she saw him looking at the cave, then at Souta, and saw him looking at her. You, what? I couldn't even see what's there even if you don't hide it? Souta said to her. You. Lamilia blushed and she didn't even know what to say anymore. Young miss is still in her growing phase, so she would grow into a fine woman after a few years. Jasmine stepped forward and said while looking at him fiercely. Then, complain to me after a few years or after she got the same body as yours, Souta said as he turned around and shrugged his shoulder. Jasmine covered her chest with her hands when she heard Souta's words. Yuko stepped forward and stuck out her tongue. She licked Souta's cheeks. Stop that. I will give you some fruit. Souta said as he patted Yuko's head. He placed his other hand on his bag and took out a fruit. He gave the fruit to her so that she would stop. He then walked beside Brian and placed his hand on Brian's shoulder. He placed his mouth near Brian's ear and whispered, after this quest, you should come with me to the red light district. I will pick the best woman for you. Brian was about to decline when Souta interrupted him. Don't worry, it's my treat. Souta patted Brian's shoulder. The group went inside the dungeon. Souta lit up a torch and he let the non-combatants hold the torch. The area inside the cave was wide so they were not cramped in a small narrow path like any other dungeons. The road was dark and they could barely see what's inside the cave. After walking for a few minutes, they saw crystals on the ceiling that was emitting light. Beautiful, Jasmine exclaimed when she saw the crystals on the ceiling. Yeah, it's pretty. Brian nodded at her words. Souta didn't have any reaction except that he thought that these crystals were convenient. These crystals were nothing compared to the crystals that lit up the undead sanctuary. Souta looked behind him and said, you can throw the torches. We don't need them anymore. Souta knew that at this point they didn't need the torches. Okay. CL.U.S.Ter nodded and she threw the torch that she was holding. She was a non-combatant so Souta gave her a task before to hold the torch. Jasmine also threw the torch that she was holding. Also, be careful, Souta warned them as he knew that they will meet monsters when they go deeper in the dungeon. Brian, Lamilia, and Fred nodded at his words. They prepared themselves to fight the monsters. Soon, they met 3 giant snakes. The snakes were 10 meters long and they have green scales. Let's kill it quickly, Souta said as he pulled out the Vajra sword. Okay. Fred nodded at him. Souta and Brian charged towards the 3 giant snakes, and Fred followed behind the 2. Swoosh. Swoosh. The snakes attacked Souta but he easily avoided it. He then slashed his sword at the snakes. His sword easily broke through the scales of the snake. Red blood spurted out of the cut he gave to the snake. Souta then jumped in the air and he twisted his body. He followed it up by waving his sword towards the head of the snake. The snake was cut into 2 cleanly. Brian pulled back his fist and he gathered his mana. He jumped and threw a powerful punch on the head of the giant snake. He landed on the ground and flames coated both of his fist. He bent his knees and threw himself at the snake. The snake was pushed back. It took damage from that punch. Suddenly, Brian saw a sword flew in the air straight to the eye of the snake. The sword pierced through the eye of the snake and Souta appeared. Souta grabbed the handle of the sword and he pushed it deeper. Chapter 63, CL.U.S. Change. Souta turned around and saw that Lamilia and Fred already finished the other giant snake. Let's go now. Souta took a glance at the corpses of the giant snake before he started to walk. He could sell them but he doesn't have enough hand to bring them back to the village. Even then, the giant snake was too large for him and it would take a lot of people to bring back a single giant snake. Also, he wouldn't get much coins if he sells this type of snake. The rest of the group followed Souta. They didn't know what Souta's goal here so they could only follow him. Fred even asked Brian what Souta's goal, but even he didn't know what Souta's objective here in this dungeon. The group continued going deeper into the dungeon. They only stopped when they saw two pathways in front of them. What should we do now, Souta? Brian asked Souta. Lamilia, Fred, Jasmine, and CL.U.S. also turned to look at him. Souta rubbed his chin and closed his eyes. He tried to recall the right way here. Where should I go? After a few moments, Souta opened his eyes. He finally recalled what's in these two pathways. These two pathways lead to the boss's room. There's not that much different except the type of monster. The monsters on the left side was an undead while on the right side was not undead. Let's go this way. Souta pointed at the left path. Okay. Brian nodded at him. Lamilia, Fred, and Jasmine don't have that much opinion regarding this matter. They will all leave this to Souta. There's a reason why he chooses the left path full of undead creatures. A spellbook was hidden in the secret room here in the left path and Souta wanted it. He could sell the spellbook for a huge amount of money after he learned the spell. It will give him an allowance for 2 months. The group entered a wide space and saw more than 50 undead blocking the way. The atmosphere turned into a cold one completely different from before. The smell of rotten meat spread in the air. Lamilia, Jasmine, and CL.U.S. pinched the nose when they smelled it. Souta took a deep breath and clenched his sword tightly. The atmosphere here was the same when he entered one of the low-level dungeons in the undead sanctuary. The scent and cold air were the same. Souta shouted as he dashed towards the group of undead. Although they were low-level undead he would still get a decent amount of EXP if he killed them. Grat. The undead noticed him, so they turned their attention at him. All of them opened their mouth revealing sharp fangs. Souta arrived in front of them and he used the skill stab consecutively. Several small holes appeared in the bodies of the undead in front of him. Brian jumped above Souta. Brian's fists were covered in flames. Brian threw a powerful punch causing a huge explosion to occur in the back. Fred looked at Souta and Brian. He opened his mouth and said, "I'll go, young miss." He then brandished his sword and charged towards the group of undead. He swiftly moved his body from side to side hole dodging every undead. He did this while waving his sword to cut the undead. Souta stopped attacking the undead when he saw Fred. He was surprised at Fred's sword skill. Fred's mastery over the sword was higher than him. As expected of a butler of a noble family. He clearly possesses some skill to prove himself. Now that Souta thought about it, he recalled that when he threw his Vajra sword before, Fred reacted quickly to parry his sword. Souta turned his head to look at Lamilia and the rest. Lamilia was standing in front of CL.U.S. and Jasmine while holding her sword in front of her. If some undead passes through Brian and Fred, she was the one who's going to fight it. Souta slightly bent his knees and launched himself towards the group of undead. Let's go, Saya. He waved the Vajra sword left and right cutting the bodies of the undead like a butter. He was getting impatient because the undead kept coming. Get down. Souta shouted and Fred and Brian looked at him. They quickly got crouched down in response to his words. Cross Moon. Souta executed one of the skills of the Vajra sword Saya. A red light swept out in the whole area and it cut every undead in front of Souta. The system prompt kept ringing in his head. Huff. There's still more. Souta inhaled deeply and shouted. He once again dashed towards the remaining undead in the back. Brian and Fred also joined the fight. It took them a dozen minutes before they cleared all the undead in this area. The undead have numbers more than Souta estimated. At first, only 50 undead appeared but as the fight goes on the undead kept appearing until they reached more than 100 in numbers. That's a lot of undead, Fred commented while looking at the dead bodies. Souta glanced at the girls and saw Jasmine was covering CL.U.S.'s eyes. He opened his mouth and said, "Ignore it if you can't stomach it." Lamilia nodded at his words. Let's get going, Jasmine. The group went deeper. They met undead in their way but its number was not the same as before. After half an hour of walking, Souta and the rest arrived in the middle part of the dungeon. The area here was wider and there's a lot of undead here. Souta, Brian, and Fred worked together to get rid of all the undead in the place. It took them 10 minutes to completely finish all the undead. Souta looked at his group and saw that they were showing signs of exhaustion, so he let them rest here for a while. Rest here, Souta said to them. He then walked around the area. Lamilia looked around the area and noticed a huge metal door at the side. What's with that door? Lamilia asked. Souta walked towards it and placed his palm on the cold surface of the door. Behind this door was the spellbook that he wanted. On top of the huge metal door, was a line with a red light. It looks like a bar and the red light was the power that operated the mechanism inside the door. Brian also walked towards the metal door. He pushed the door with all of his might but the door didn't budge an inch. I can't open it, Brian said, and he tried to punch the door. His punch didn't even leave a dent on the door. You wouldn't be able to open the door inside the dungeon easily, Souta said to Brian. CL.U.S.Ter also walked towards the door and placed her palm on the surface of the door. CL.U.S.Ter. Jasmine called her but CL.U.S.Ter ignored her. Lamilia and Fred looked at CL.U.S.Ter with a curious expression. Souta noticed that CL.U.S.Ter's eyes were lifeless. It was different from her usual expression. It feels like someone was taking over her body and controlling her. He took a step back and observed her. He wondered what she will do and he was also curious about the secret she's hiding. A magic circle appeared in her palm. Then, the red bar above the door shone brightly before they heard the metallic sound inside the door indicating that she opened the door. CL.U.S.Ter suddenly loses her consciousness. She fell down and Brian, who was beside her, caught her before she landed. The huge metal door slowly opened and revealed a dark room. What? Souta was shocked when he saw this. The way she opened the door was different from what he knew. How did she do that? He tried to recall if there's another way to open the door but unfortunately, he couldn't think of anything. The only way to open this door was to fill the red bar using the bodies of the undead, but CL.U.S.Ter did it in her own way. How? Souta doesn't have any ideas on how she did that. He stepped forward and looked at CL.U.S.Ter on Brian's arms. He checked her pulse and found that she was just unconscious. What happened, Souta? Brian asked him while looking at CL.U.S.Ter with a hint of concern in his eyes. She's fine. You don't have to worry about her, Souta said to him. He then entered the dark room behind the door. He used his fireball spell to create light. The light from the fireball illuminated the whole room. Souta saw a bunch of equipment on the ground. The grade of the equipment ranges from colorless to blue grade. The one that caught his attention was the normal-looking chest at the back of the room. This thing was hiding the spellbook that he wanted. Okay, let's check it out, Souta said as he stepped forward. Chapter 64, Undead Cyclops. Souta squatted down and placed his hands on the side of the chest before he opened it. Inside the chest, he saw a thick black book. The book looks ordinary and it doesn't have any titles indicating what's written inside this book. The Undead Light Spell. A spell where he could shot a dark light. If the target was undead, they will only lose their energy. But if it's not undead, the target will lose their life force and the life force will go to the user. And if the target died using the skill, then the target will become undead. The user will be able to use the life force he/she collected to increase the damage of his/her attack and defense. The spell can only target one person at a time. It will increase by leveling up the skill. It also cannot be used while using another spell. Souta smiled looking at the spellbook on his hand. This spell was a tier 2 spell. It means that he couldn't use his skill points to learn this skill as he only had a low-level class. Tier 2 spell was for those who have mid-level class and Tier 3 spell was for those who have high-level class. But Souta didn't have a plan to use skill points to learn this skill. He will try to learn it manually. After he learned the spell, he would also try if he could imprint it in his inner consciousness, making it an inner spell just like the rest of his spell. Souta, what's that? Lamilia asked him from behind. Souta glanced at her and said, it's a spell book. Is that the reason why you came here? Lamilia nodded and asked. Nope, I don't even know that this spell is here in the first place, Souta answered her. He said this because he wanted her to know that he doesn't have any idea about what's inside this room. It will be suspicious if he knew what's inside the locked door. I see. So what's your reason? Lamilia nodded and asked what's his objective in this place. The rotten venomous green apple, Souta replied. Since they were already here and they will know his goal when they arrived in the boss room, Souta decided to tell her. Did real venomous green apple grow here? Lamilia asked him with wide eyes. She heard about the venomous green apple, so she had an idea about it. Then, something came into her mind. Rotten. Yeah, it decayed because of the negative energy of the undead that is guarding the venomous green apple. That's the reason why it became a rotten venomous green apple. Souta explained to her. That's unfortunate. Lamilia said as she lowered her head. She knew that the value of the venomous green apple was greater than the mystical light cherry, but since it was a rotten one the value became less than the cherry. Well, the client still wants it, so what could I do? Souta shrugged his shoulder. I see. Lamilia recalled that Brian said that they came here because of the quest. Clap. Souta clapped his hand to gather everyone's attention and said, you can pick anything that you wanted here. We could bring all of this equipment, so pick the thing that you only want. Lamilia, Fred, and Jasmine just stayed in their place. They were not interested in some blue-grade equipment. But Brian was different. He wasn't a noble and he didn't have money to buy his own set of equipment. All the money he earned was for paying the institute. Brian was excited when he saw a lot of equipments on the ground. He went around to look at the equipment with an excited expression. You can pick anything you want, Brian. You can also sell it. Souta advised to Brian. Okay. Brian nodded as he continued to check every equipment on the floor. Souta looked around and picked up some blue-grade equipment. He then called Yuko and hung those equipments in her back. Good. We will earn a few hundred gold coins for these equipments. Souta nodded with a satisfied expression. Souta looked at his stats and saw that Harvester of the Soul only need a few more souls before he could use its effect once again. The souls of the monsters, bandits, and the undead that he killed before almost filled the bar. Just a little bit more and his stats would increase once again. His base stats were mostly in balance right now. His strength attribute would increase than any of his attributes because he picked it when he evolved into high-end goblin. His agility and dexterity attributes were catching up because of the Harvester of the Soul. And his intelligence attributes were also increasing because of his class. The only thing he lacks was a skill to increase his vitality attributes. The group waited for CL.U.S.Tur to regain her consciousness. She woke up after 30 minutes since she opened the door. Souta didn't ask her how she managed to open the door because he thought that CL.U.S.Tur doesn't have any idea about that. Even if she knew that side of her, she will keep silent about it because she already hid why those people from before were after her. Naturally, she doesn't want to talk about it. Lamilia also didn't ask about it. Since she didn't ask about, naturally Fred and Jasmine wouldn't ask too. Brian was different. He was just amazed and praised CL.U.S.Tur because she managed to open the door that he couldn't open. Okay, we will go now, Souta said to them while glancing at CL.U.S.Tur. CL.U.S.Tur was beside Jasmine, still feeling weak. It seems that she exhausted her strength in opening the door. Souta then looked at Jasmine. You stay beside CL.U.S.Tur. He planned to quickly kill the boss, the undead Cyclops, with this group. He, Brian, Yuko, Lamilia, and Fred will attack the boss. He knew how powerful the boss, so even with this group it would take some time. Yeah. I will protect her. Jasmine nodded and she patted CL.U.S.Tur's head. Good. Souta nodded. Souta led them to the boss room. Their journey wasn't smooth as they met some undead on their way to the boss room. Since all of them were fighting except for CL.U.S.Tur and Jasmine, they easily eliminated those undead. Half an hour later they arrived in front of a wide space. The area of the boss room was wider than any other part of the dungeon here. The distance between the ceiling and the floor was 25 meters. Souta and the rest looked inside and saw a 5-meter-tall undead standing in the center of the room. This was the boss of this dungeon, the undead Cyclops. Beside the undead Cyclops was a tall rock and on top of it was a small tree without any leaf. They only saw one fruit which was hanging in one of its branches. So that's the venomous green apple. Jasmine said in wonder while looking at the green apple. Yeah, and that's my goal. Souta nodded and turned his attention to Yuko. He approached her and took the equipments that were hanging on her back. He then placed it on the ground. He did this so that Yuko could fight without restraint. Jasmine, stay out of the fight, Lamilia said to Jasmine. Yes, young miss. Jasmine nodded at her. You can go now, Souta said as he patted Yuko's back. Yuko roared and she charged towards the undead Cyclops. The undead Cyclops noticed her, so it turned its body and faced Yuko. The two clashed, causing a loud sound that echoed in the whole room. Here I go. Brian clenched his fist as he bent his knees and charged towards the undead Cyclops. Lamilia closed her eyes and she gathered her mana in her palm. She then cast a spell towards the undead Cyclops. Water Blade. A blade made of water shot towards the back of the undead Cyclops. Shadowbind. Souta also used his spell to restrict the movements of the undead Cyclops. Fred also charged as he joined Brian and Yuko in battling the undead Cyclops. While Lamilia and Souta provided them support using their spells. Agility Boost. Strength Boost. Souta cast his support spell on Brian, Fred, and Yuko. He looked at them before he pulled out the Vajra sword Saya on his waist. He looked at Lamilia and said, I will join them, you can continue supporting us using your magic. Lamilia nodded and she cast Water Bomb spell. Brian, Fred, and Yuko took a distance away from the undead Cyclops and Lumilia's spell exploded. Continue. Souta shouted. He knew that the undead Cyclops wouldn't die that easily. The boss was a powerful undead. It possessed the power to carry the level of this dungeon higher than the low-level dungeon, so it wouldn't die easily. They nodded at him before they launched themselves at the boss of this dungeon. Chapter 65, Fighting the Undead Cyclops. Boss Battle, defeat the boss and conquer the dungeon. Rewards, 5000 EXP, 2 free attribute points, and 1 skill point. The rewards of this quest were higher than the previous quest he did in the dungeon. It was because the level of this dungeon wasn't entirely a low-level dungeon. Its level hover between the low-level and mid-level dungeons. I will get another skill points, that's what matters. Souta smiled. A loud sound echoed in the whole room as Yuko exchanged blows with the undead Cyclops. Yuko was getting pushed back by the power of the undead Cyclops when Brian appeared above her and shot a powerful punch at the enemy. Brian's flaming fist hit the face of the undead Cyclops. The undead was pushed back a little bit by his punch. The undead waved its hand towards Brian, but Yuko blocked it for him. Thanks, Yuko. Brian smiled and he cast lightning boots and lightning edge spell. Bang. 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 Fred moved behind the undead and executed his own combat arts. Rippling slash. White energy coated his sword before he swung it at the back of the undead Cyclops. A large cut appeared on the back of the undead. The undead felt the power of the slash, so it turned around and shot a kick towards Fred. Fred noticed it, so he quickly reacted by moving his body sideways. He avoided the kick and launched a counterattack. He slashed the feet of the undead Cyclops. Suddenly, the undead Cyclops roared in a very loud voice. The roar shook the entire area. Brian and Fred covered their ears as both of them took a step back. Damn, it's crazy strong. Brian looked at the undead Cyclops with eagerness in his eyes. Let me try it for a second. Souta looked at Brian when he heard those words. He nodded and called Yuko. Stay back, let Brian hold the undead for a while. Are you sure? Fred went beside Souta and asked. Souta just nodded his head while looking at the undead Cyclops. The undead Cyclops started to emit strange black energy. It was color black and everyone could see the energy with their own eyes. It then gathered the energy in its eye. It formed a ball of black energy and it was getting stronger every second. The black energy shot a beam towards them. Get down. Souta said as he pushed Fred to avoid the black beam at all costs. Brian also jumped away to dodge the beam. Lumilia took Jasmine and CL.U.S.Ter with her. A loud explosion that shook the entire room occurred. Thick smoke and dust covered the area of the explosion. Some of the crystals on the ceiling started to fall down. It looks like the entire place was going to crumble down. Souta knew that this place wasn't going to crumble with just one attack of that level. This place was built to hold the boss here, so it could even take the strongest blow the boss could give. What power? Fred exclaimed looking at the explosion. Water barrier. Lumilia cast a barrier to protect CL.U.S.Ter and Jasmine from the falling debris. Damn, what a strong one. Brian charged towards the undead Cyclops without hesitation. He jumped in the air and aimed his palm on the undead. Thunder shock. Lightning ground. Glowing flame. Brian cast his attacking spell at the undead Cyclops. Flames and lightning appeared one after another and it looks like it was going to devour the undead. The undead Cyclops ignored the damage it took and attacked Brian. It launched a barrage of punches towards him. Brian swiftly avoided all the punches of the undead with his speed. He clenched his fist tightly and he jumped towards the face of the undead. Brian smirked and cast a powerful spell burst flame. Whoa. That packs a lot of power. Souta exclaimed looking at Brian's show of power. To think that Brian holds this much power was something he didn't expect. Souta would say that Brian with mana and spell was 5 times stronger than the Brian in the tournament. Souta shook his head and said, but that's enough now, let's go. He patted Yuko and let her join the fight. Suddenly, Lumilia shouted from behind. Back down. Brian heard her voice so he took a distance from the undead Cyclops. Yuko who just joined the fight was forced to back down. Water serpent. A huge serpent made of water formed behind Lumilia. Lumilia pointed her fingers at the undead Cyclops and she controlled the serpent to attack the undead. The serpent's speed was high as it quickly arrived before the undead. The serpent moved above before it got down and clashed on the face of the undead. Follow up. Water bomb. Water blade. Lumilia showed her powerful spells. The power of her spell could be compared to Brian's spell. She then crouched down and placed both of her palms on the ground. Greater ice spike. Spike made of ice burst out of the ground. The area of effect of this skill could cover the whole space of this room, but she didn't do it because she had her comrades here. The spike pierced the huge body of the undead Cyclops. Whoa. You're crazy strong too, class rep. Brian exclaimed in a loud voice. Suddenly, the spikes were shattered like a fragile glass. All of them focused their sight on the undead Cyclops. The undead was releasing a very powerful aura right now. The aura caused ripples in the air. The undead Cyclops' body expanded and it became 7 meters tall. Its eye turned red in color and red veins started to pop up around its body. What's that? Jasmine looked at the undead Cyclops. She was worried about the one who's fighting such a monster. It still have so much power. Fred exclaimed as he covered his eyes with his hand. TCH. A good one. Brian clicked his tongue when he saw that the undead Cyclops still holds a power they couldn't expect. Lamilia just looked at the undead as she bit her lower lips. Souta knew what's that. It's the Berserk mode skill of the undead Cyclops. It will activate when its health goes down to 1/4. It's our time, Yuko. Souta shouted and he waved his sword. Yuko roared and charged towards the undead Cyclops in response to his words. Souta followed behind Yuko and he used dash to increase his speed. He also used agility boost and strength boost on himself. He jumped above Yuko and looked at the undead Cyclops. He aimed his sword at the undead and executed stab consecutively. The undead Cyclops felt the power of his attack, so it turned its attention on him. It swung its huge arm towards him. Souta smirked as he gripped his sword tightly. He then executed the skill of the Vajra sword Saya. The red light of the Vajra sword and the huge hand of the undead Cyclops collided. Blood burst out of the hand of the undead. The flesh of its hand slowly crumbled under the power of the Vajra sword. Souta then twisted his body in the air and swung his sword. The huge hand of the undead Cyclops fell down on the ground with a loud thud sound. At this time, Yuko arrived in front of the undead. She increased her speed and tackled the huge undead in front of her. She then moved both of her hands and smashed the undead Cyclops. Yuko saw that her attack wasn't doing any damage to the undead, so she opened her mouth and a ball of fire formed. Burning shout. A flame swept out in the whole area and it almost hit Souta. Souta was shocked when he saw this. It was his first time seeing Yuko used her trait skill. He smiled and said, "Good girl, Yuko. Keep it up." After a few moments, Yuko stopped her trait skill. Souta saw the area was burned and the undead Cyclops was still moving. Although it was moving, Souta knew that it would fall anytime. He dashed towards it and waved his sword like a madman. Slice. He only stopped when he heard a sound in his mind. You've received 1891 EXP from defeating the undead Cyclops. You've received 5000 EXP. It's done, Souta said as the undead Cyclops fell in the ground. He checked the system first before he went up to the tall rock. He picked up the rotten venomous green apple and placed it inside a container. That's mission complete, Brian said as he walked towards Souta. Yeah, thanks. Souta nodded and thanked him. He packed the container inside his bag. I hope you don't forget what you promised to young miss, Fred said at the side. Don't worry, I will help you. Souta grinned at him. He wouldn't abandon a mission that will give him 5 skill points. Chapter 66, Next Quest. Souta packed the container inside his bag. He stood up and said, "You can rest here. After we rest, we will head to get the mystical light cherry for class rep." Brian and Fred nodded at him. They sat down and tried to recover their energy as fast as possible. How about you? Jasmine asked him. Me, I'm going to see what's this undead, Souta said as he walked towards the undead Cyclops. Lamilia just looked at him before she closed her eyes. Souta sat down in front of the undead Cyclops and sliced a piece of its meat. He placed it inside the other container that he bought. It's one of the requirements for his next evolution, the meat of the level 20 and above undead. Now that he acquired all the materials needed for his next evolution, the only thing he needed was to level up to 20. He doesn't need to worry about that now as his priority was to complete Lamilia's quest. The rewards of her quest were the highest all of the quest he received ever since he came here in this world. He will undergo evolution once he finished this quest. After that, he will focus on leveling up his class. Currently, he was just a rank 1 mage. To promote to rank 2 mage, he needed to level up once of his specialty to level 10. Leveling up a spell was completely different from leveling up a combat arts like his stab skill. It was different from combat arts that could be trained to level up. The spell was made up of a magic circle. He needed to know how to build up a magic circle without relying on his system. This was the reason why he enrolled in the Ladro Institute. The group rested inside the boss room for almost an hour. They recovered some of their energy in this time, so Souta lead them out of the dungeon. "Oh, that undead was crazy strong," Brian said after they got out the dungeon. "Don't worry about it, you have the potential to surpass it," Souta commented. Lamilia agreed at him. She knew that Brian had 4 affinities and only powerful people possessed 4 affinities. In the future, Brian would become 1 too with proper training. "Okay, prepare yourself. Our opponent this time isn't some mindless undead. Souta clapped and said. The battle this time will be hard, harder than conquering the dungeon, so be prepared. The nobles from both Hebre Kingdom and Melosa country will be our opponents. Also, some of the high-level adventurers will be there to get the mystical light cherry. Lamilia, Fred, and Jasmine nodded with a gloomy expression. They knew that it will become a fierce battle if the nobles from other countries were involved in this fight. Bring it on, Brian said with a smile. He was excited to fight strong people from another country. But something is strange here. Souta said as he looked around. Something is strange. Brian looked at Souta with a questioning gaze. Souta looked at them and asked, Are any of you familiar with this forest? No, this is my first time here. Brian shook his head. We came here before but we didn't enter this deep, Fred said. Souta nodded in understanding. He opened his mouth and said, In the books, they said that we shouldn't enter the inner part of the desolate woods if we don't have enough strength. Yeah, why? Jasmine nodded and asked. In this part of the forest, there's a lot of powerful monsters. 2 types of these monsters even possess a monster orb. So why we haven't met those monsters? Souta carefully said to them. Do you mean? Fred looks like he understood what Souta was saying. Yeah, I think someone with enough power came here and killed those monsters, Souta said. But, why? Mystical light cherry is nothing to someone that powerful. Fred asked. I don't know their reason but it seems that we need to be extra careful in getting the mystical light cherry, Souta said. Fred looked at Lamilia and asked, Young miss, what should we do? Lamilia lowered her head. She was having a hard time deciding what to do. She couldn't let Fred and Jasmine to be put in danger because of her decision. Don't worry, young miss. No matter what you do I will support you. Jasmine said. Me too. Don't worry about me. I don't want you to worry about me. I can run anytime and I'm confident about this. CL.U.S. slowly raised her hand and said meekly. Souta smiled looking at them. He opened his mouth and said, Don't worry about it. When the time comes, I will do anything to get that mystical light cherry for you. Lamilia lifted up her head and looked at him in the eyes. Ha ha ha, yeah we will help you. Brian laughed and said. Where's the one that will become a sacrifice for our god, Julia said while looking around at his surroundings. We will arrive there soon, Carmilla replied to him. These 2 people were the commandments of the god's will called. They came here to retrieve the body of a certain god from ancient times. They didn't have much information about that god as a lot of information about the ancient era was gone. Only a few pieces of information were passed down and a lot of people treated that information as a sacred treasure. For the love of our god. We must complete this mission as soon as possible. Julius said. Naturally, we couldn't afford to fail this mission, Carmilla said. She then stopped moving and looked in the sky. She opened her mouth and said, Someone is coming here. He more sacrifice, Julius said as he opened his arms widely. They didn't even bother hiding their aura. Carmilla smiled. With her power, she could sense people who didn't bother to hide their aura a few kilometers away. Especially, those people clearly had hostility while coming in this direction. So it's not that surprising that she felt those people. Carmilla shook her head and said, They didn't even realize that they will only become a sacrifice if they went here. A middle-aged man was heading towards the desolate woods at a fast speed. The middle-aged man had an angry expression on his face. He has blonde hair that was combed behind his head. His pupils were gleaming with an intent to kill. How dare you kill my son? He said with an angry expression. A few hours ago, he sensed that the life force of his son disappeared in the desolate woods so he quickly flew towards it. He had a special bloodline where he could sense the life force of his descendants and know their location. Those descendants of his could provide him their power through his connection with them. He was going to kill the one who killed his son. He couldn't contain his rage anymore. Back in the Dry Gulch town. A lot of nobles died in the inner part of the desolate woods according to some adventurer that went there. The heck? This is bad. The head of the town received a report that a lot of people with backgrounds died in the desolate woods. The head was shocked when he received such reports. Since this town was closest to the desolate woods, the backer of those people would naturally question him about this. He needed to come up with report and know the truth about their death in the desolate woods. This is getting bad. Something is happening in the desolate woods. The head gritted his teeth. He stood up and looked at his assistant and said, Prepare my armor, I will go there myself to investigate it. The assistant nodded and bowed his head before he left. The head looked at his assistant's retreating figure before he walked towards the window and looked at the direction of the desolate woods. Suddenly, he sensed a powerful aura coming to his direction. Hiss. They are here. I need to come up with an excuse. He couldn't help but sigh. He knew he was no match about those powerful nobles from large countries. He could only curse those idiot second generation that only relies on their parents. Damn, Who would have the guts to kill those idiots? Souta and the rest stood in their place with wide eyes. In front of them were the bodies of dead monsters, demis, and humans. The whole area was dyed in red because of the blood of dead creatures. This. Jasmine covered her mouth with her hand. She was shocked by what's in front of her. Young miss. Fred muttered as he turned his head and looked at Lamilia. Lamilia swallowed her saliva. To think that what Souta said before was true. Souta observed the corpses around them and he even saw monsters with a monster orb. There's even a people wearing a knight armor. Ha ha ha, this is bad news. He could only smile wryly at the scene. He had an idea of how powerful the person that could do this violence. Chapter 67, Battle for the Mystical Light Cherry, start. What should we do, young miss? Fred asked Lamilia with a concerned tone. Lamilia hesitated to answer him and when she was about to reply Souta interrupted her. Don't worry, the person who's capable of doing this wouldn't have an interest in a mere mystical light cherry, Souta said. He clearly knew that those powerful people wouldn't get an interest in a fruit that will not give them any benefits. For them, the benefits they will receive from mystical light cherry was close to none. They wouldn't even feel the increase in their strength even if they consumed a dozen of it. What if we met those people? Jasmine interjected. What she was worried the most was Lamilia's safety. If we somehow met them, then don't do anything that will get in their nerves. We should just leave them and do nothing. Souta said. As long as they don't offend those people then they would be safe. He could see from the scene that these people didn't die without fighting. These people and monsters all died with one strike on their necks. Although they died with one strike, Souta could see that there's proof of other skill that was launched. Trees were burned and shattered ice was on the ground. In other words, these people attacked first before they died with one strike. As long as we don't attack them then we're good, Souta added. Oh okay. Lamilia nodded then she closed her eyes and took a deep breath. When she opened her eyes, a determination could be seen flashing in her eyes. Souta turned his attention to Brian. He slowly opened his mouth and said, don't do anything. Just keep quiet for a while. I know. Brian nodded at him. Ignore those bodies. We will go now. Souta said to them. The group walked for half an hour before they arrived in the part where the mystical light cherry ripened. We're here in the rumored part of the forest where the mystical light cherry ripened, Souta said to the group. Here in this place, there's a chance that people who are after the mystical light cherry will only attack us once we got the cherry in our hands. Okay, I'm itching to fight someone, Brian said with a smirk on his face. Brian, don't start attacking people. We will see first if they are enemies or not. Souta said to Brian sternly. Yeah, if you want to help young miss then do that. Jasmine backed up Souta. I know. Brian smiled awkwardly as he scratched the back of his head. CL.U.S.Ter, stay beside Jasmine. Don't wander around. Souta said to CL.U.S.Ter. MN. Don't worry about me. CL.U.S.Ter said in a low voice. She gripped the hem of her clothes while looking at Souta straight in the eyes. Good. Souta smiled when he saw her eyes. It seems that he doesn't need to worry about her. A loud booming sound echoed in the whole area and it was followed by a huge explosion. Souta, Yuko, Lamilia, Brian, Fred, and Jasmine looked up. They saw a huge mushroom of smoke rose up in the air. As expected some people are already fighting for the cherry, Souta muttered. From the looks of it, the battle already started and it looks like it's been a while since it started. There's also a possibility that some people got the mystical light cherry. Let's hurry. Souta said before he started to run towards the direction of the explosion. Yuko followed him without hesitation. Okay. Brian nodded and he also ran towards Souta. Lamilia, Fred, and Jasmine looked at each other before they followed behind Souta. A man wearing a full plate armor was breathing heavily. His armor had a lot of dent and cracks in it. He slowly raised his arm and wiped the blood on his mouth. He took a deep breath and said, they're quite strong, master. I know. I'm having a hard time too, so can you please shut up and focus on killing them? A young man with long black hair said with an annoyed expression. He was a young noble from Melosa country and in front of him were his knights. The one they were fighting were the wood-eater apes. The wood-eater apes was 1 meter in height. Although, they weren't that tall their power was something else. Their level was between 20 and 39. It means that these apes already evolved twice. The wood-eater apes live in a pack and they were rarely seen alone. Even when they were hunting, they were still forming a group. Even if their prey was weaker than them. These wood-eater apes were the ones that were guarding the mystical light cherry. To get the cherry the humans and demis needed to defeat the apes and the leader of the pack. The leader of the pack was a powerful ape that already formed its own monster orb. It means that the leader was level 40 and above. Young master, they are too strong. The man in full plate armor said. Shut up. Just go and take the fruit. The young man shouted. I understand, young master. The man in full plate armor nodded and raised his sword in the air. He shouted, let's go, guys. Souta and the rest hid in the bushes. They observed the fight between these knights and apes. Souta was quite shocked when he found that the one who's guarding the mystical light cherry was a monster that formed its monster orb. The earth-crawler ape was the leader of the pack of the wood-eater ape. The earth-crawler ape was a 3-meter-tall ape with brown fur. Its arm was large and muscles were bulging. What should we do, Souta? Fred asked Souta. He knew that he could count on Souta in this kind of situation. He saw before that Souta had confidence in getting the mystical light cherry, so he will bet on it. He knew that his young miss wouldn't ask Souta for advice even when they were classmates. We will wait here for a while. Let them fight each other. Souta said in a low voice. He then turned his head and looked at Brian. I know. Before Souta could even say anything, Brian already answered him. It's good that you understand it. Souta nodded with a satisfied expression. They watched how the knights fought the powerful wood-eater apes. The apes have an advantage in terms of physical abilities, but the knights' skill was better than apes. Also, their teamwork clearly surpasses the apes and it led the knights to defeat a lot of apes. But there's a problem. The numbers of the ape were greater than the knights. Souta could guess that the knights would lose their strength and would die soon. Also, the earth-crawler ape wasn't even moving. After a few minutes of fighting, another group of knights appeared in the scene. It seems that these two groups knew each other, so both of them decided to cooperate and kill the apes first. While they were watching the knights fought the apes, Souta heard several footsteps behind him. He quickly stood up and looked behind. He saw a group of adventurers coming at this direction. Souta looked at Lumilia then back at the adventurers. The distance between them wasn't that large, so it's impossible to run. The clash between them was inevitable. Fred, come here. The rest stay away. Souta picked the most rational one among the group to come with him. Fred didn't answer him immediately. Instead, he looked at Lumilia first, and when he saw her nod, he stood up. Souta looked at Brian and said, Brian, don't do anything. He then looked at Lumilia. Class rep, I'll leave them to you. Okay. Lumilia nodded at him. The adventurers stopped 5 meters away from Souta and Fred. The adventurers looked at Souta and Fred up and down. They could see that Souta was an adventurer like them, but Fred was different. Fred was a butler of a noble house and they could see it in his outfit. After they finished assessing Souta and Fred, they looked behind them. They saw 3 girls, 1 boy, and a bear. They determined that CL.U.S.Ter was a noble from the way the girls were protecting her. Why are you here? Fred opened his mouth and asked the adventurers. Before the adventurers arrive here, Souta said that he will be the one that will talk with the adventurers. I will ask you the same question. Why are you here? A man with a huge build stepped forward. While Fred and the adventurers were talking to each other, Souta was observing them from top to bottom. Their weapon, height, build, clothes, and feet. According to what he saw, these people weren't the ones who killed the monsters and nobles back there. Their weapons wouldn't leave the same mark like those people. Really, I'm getting too worried about the people who killed those people and monsters, Souta muttered with a grin on his face. He then slowly raised a thumbs up in the air. He said, it's okay. We can go all out now. Chapter 68, Battle for the Mystical Light Cherry, Monster Orb Release. Brian, you can go now. Souta shouted. The clash between his group and the other people that were after the mystical light cherry was inevitable. He got worried because of the people who killed those monsters. But now, he thought that he doesn't need to worry about it. He then turned his head to Jasmine and said, protect her. It's going to get chaotic now. Justin nodded her head and she pulled CL.U.S.Ter to her chest. Souta jumped above the tree and saw that a lot of people were coming. The fight broke out in all areas. Brian charged towards the adventurers as soon as Souta gave him the signal. He gathered his mana on his fist and shot a powerful punch. The adventurer saw it. He grabbed the axe on his back and swung it towards Brian. Both of their attacks collided, causing the earth to shook. Another 2 adventurers moved their body and appeared in both of Brian's side. Both of them quickly pulled out their weapons and waved it towards Brian. Clang. Clang. Brian saw a figure in front of him. It was Fred. He smiled and said, thanks. After Fred blocked those attacks, Fred stepped forward and slashed his sword. Every time their weapon clashed, sparks flew out. Fred's sword skill was overwhelming the 2 adventurers in front of him. He waved his sword with a speed surpassing the 2 adventurers. Guh. Arg. This guy. The 2 adventurers could only defend with their life on the line. Brian looked at Fred, who was fighting 2 adventurers at the same time. He lifted up his hand and cast several spells. Lightning Edge. Lightning Boots. Scorching Hand. Lightning crackled and flames rose up covering his hand. Okay, let's do this. Brian smiled. The adventurers pulled out their weapons and their mana flared up. 3 of them quickly ran forward in the direction of Fred. These 3 wanted to help their comrades to defeat Fred. I won't let you, Brian said as he disappeared from his place. Crackle. He appeared in front of the 3 adventurers. Attack him. One of them shouted and launched his sword skill. Sword slash. The other 2 followed suit and executed their own skills. Glittering slice. Darting stab. Brian moved his body left and right, dodging the attacks with a speed that they couldn't comprehend. He then proceeded to punch the 3 adventurers in the face with his scorching hand. That's the high-level spell Lightning Boots and Lightning Edge. One of the adventurers recognized the spell that Brian used. They subconsciously took a step back. The leader of the group of adventurers was a young man with long black hair that was tied in a ponytail. He has fox ears and tails. The leader took a step forward and brandished his sword. He controlled his mana and poured it in his sword. He instantly appeared in front of Brian and swung his sword. So fast. Brian quickly reacted and he moved his body sideways. He then lifted up his feet and launched a powerful kick at the leader. The leader blocked it using his free hand and once again swung his sword towards Brian. Brian swiftly moved his hand in front of him and the sword and his lightning edge collided. Both of them took a distance to each other. You're strong. I can see that you're an adventurer. What's your rank? The leader asked. You're crazy strong too. But I'm just an E rank. Brian replied with a smile on his face. With your strength, you're just an E rank. Why don't you join us and I will help you rank up to D rank? The leader opened his palm and he invited Brian to join him. Unfortunately, my answer is no, Brian said. That's really unfortunate. The leader said and he dashed straight to Brian. Brian lifted up both of his hands and clashed against the leader. Lamilia, who was in the back, lifted up both of her hands above her head. Her magical power rose up to the peak. The leader stopped for a moment when he felt Lamilia's mana. He looked around and saw her in the back. Stop her! He shouted while pointing his sword at Lamilia. Suddenly, a fist crashed into his face. He flew away and crashed in the tree. You should focus on your opponent when you're fighting someone, Brian said. The other adventurers snapped out of their daze and dashed towards her. I will help you. Souta, who was observing the other battles in the area, looked down at Lamilia. He silently cast Shadow Bind to stop the movements of the adventurers. What's this? The adventurers panicked when their shadows suddenly bind them. Freezing point. Lamilia finished casting the high-level spell that she was preparing. The temperature suddenly drops and the wind blew strongly. The ground started to turn into ice and all adventurers turned into an ice sculpture. Brian stopped moving and looked at the scene with wide eyes. He was shocked that the area around him turned into ice. This was the power of a Tier 2 spell. Everything around Lamilia turned into ice except her comrades. Precisely, it was 100 meters around her. The spell even stopped the other fights in the area around them. Lamilia fell down on her knees. The Tier 2 spell freezing point drained almost all of her mana in her mana pool. As expected of class rep, she have Tier 2 spell in her sleeves, Souta muttered. Even he doesn't know any Tier 2 spell. All the spell he had were only a Tier 1 spell for his low-level class. He then cast the spell Shadow Spike to broke the ice. The spike pierced through the body of the people that were turned into ice. It painlessly killed all those people without even fighting back. Souta shook his head as he heard several system prompts inside his head. Now, that the fight here concluded, let me see the mystical light cherry. Souta stood up while patting his clothes. He looked at the mystical light cherry from his position and saw that it was still there. The freezing point spell didn't even leave a scratch to it. The earth crawler ape protected the cherry from any harm. Souta called Brian and let him see the mystical light cherry. I want you to steal the cherry when there's an opportunity, Souta said to Brian. He looked at Fred and said, the butler and I will distract the earth crawler ape later. Lamilia, you stay with the maid and cl.u.s.ter. You will immediately take them once Brian got the cherry. Souta explained his plan to them. He and Fred will distract the earth crawler ape while Brian will steal the cherry. The plan was to let the ape fight the other people first. Do you have a question? Souta asked as he looked at their face one by one. Lamilia shook her head and went beside Jasmine and cl.u.s.ter. She doesn't have much mana left, so Souta left her with Jasmine and cl.u.s.ter. Yuko, you stay with them and don't let anyone approach them, Souta said to Yuko. Mew. Yuko lowered her head in front of Souta. Souta smiled and he patted her head. He knew that she wanted a pat when she lowered her head in front of him. Good girl. The earth crawler ape roared loudly and it shook the whole area. The ape emitted a reddish aura and the orb on its chest glowed brightly. The reddish aura swept out like ripples in the air. All the people who felt it stopped for a moment. This energy was different from mana. This energy was much more destructive and violent than mana. Yuko felt fear looking at the earth crawler ape. The ape was finally using its beast energy. This is best Faram. Fred shuddered when he felt the beast energy in the surrounding. The legendary energy of a monster that's more powerful than mana that we, humans and demis, use, Lamilia muttered while looking at the ape. Her instinct was telling her to run away. This is really something else. Souta smiled wryly looking at the scene. This made him want the monster orb more. He was truly looking forward when he formed his own monster orb and used the beast energy. The beast energy was suppressing the mana in the whole area. It made the people, who had low control in their mana, hard to cast a spell. The earth crawler ape roared once again and the orb in its chest emitted a black line. The black line stuck on the body of the ape and it became a black tattoo. The air of the ape was continuously rising without stopping. Oi! It's even no the monster orb release. Souta said as he gripped the Vajra sword Saya on his waist. Monster orb release was a skill of a monster that releases the full potential of the monster orb. The overall stats of the monster will drastically increase once they activate the skill. The people who were near the ape felt the suppression in the air. They started to tremble as fear and despair seep in their hearts. The ape turned its head to the people who were fighting the wood-eater apes before. The ground shook slightly every time the ape took a step forward. No way. They could only watch as the ape approached them slowly. Chapter 69, Battle for the Mystical Light Cherry, Bistru. The earth crawler ape used the monster orb release skill. The appearance of the ape drastically changed. Its brown fur turned into blood-red color as jet black tattoo emerged in its body. The ape roared loudly and it shook the entire area. It was followed up by ripples of beast energy in the air. The group of knights was trembling in fear. They couldn't do anything but watch the earth crawler ape approach them. They were the nearest group that was close to the mystical light cherry and they also killed most of the wood-eater ape. Actually, the earth crawler ape wouldn't even move. But Lamilia freezing point spell triggered the ape to move. It sensed the danger behind that spell and it caused the ape to move. The other groups who were fighting each other stopped when they felt the tier 2 spell and it was followed up by the transformation of the earth crawler ape. Including Souta's group, there were more than 5 groups in the area around the mystical light cherry. They were all close to the mystical light cherry. Some of them were adventurers from Hebre Kingdom and the other were nobles from Melosa country. The nobles from Melosa country have great animosity to the people of Hebre Kingdom because of what happened in the past. They became a laughing stock at that time. Their boasted powerful army was pushed back by one person. If the nobles from Melosa country were given a chance then they would take it just to get revenge on Hebre Kingdom. Since the adventurers here were working for the people of Hebre Kingdom, the nobles from Melosa country would try to get rid of them. They wouldn't let any force of the Hebre Kingdom get the mystical light cherry. That's the reason why the fight broke out in all areas. But now it stopped. It was because of the transformation of the earth crawler ape. The transformation led them to realize that no matter how much they killed each other they wouldn't be able to acquire the mystical light cherry as long as the earth crawler ape was still alive. Souta, Brian, and Fred were hiding on the top of the tree. They were watching how the battle will unfold. Their number was less than all the groups in this place. Lamilia, Jasmine, Yuko, and CL.U.S. were hiding far away from this place. They were preparing themselves to run away as soon as Brian get the mystical light cherry. As I said before, we will wait. We're not going to fight that monster head on. We're just going to distract it for you, Brian. Souta said while looking at the ape. He knew that their power wasn't enough for the earth crawler ape. No matter what they did they wouldn't be able to defeat it. His plan was only to distract the ape and Brian would do his job. Okay, I know my role. I just need to steal that cherry, right? Brian nodded and glanced at the mystical light cherry. Yeah, but you need to run away as fast as you can after you stole the cherry, Souta said. Okay. Brian nodded as he rubbed his palm together. All the nobles and adventurers' attention was going to turn to Brian once he stole the cherry. Also, the earth crawler ape would chase after him. That's why Souta asked him if he knew another spell that could raise his speed other than lightning boots. He replied to Souta by saying that he still has more spells that he hasn't shown, so there's no need to worry. The ape charged to the group of knights. The young noble from Melosa country was scared and he fell down on his butt. Ah! Stop that monster! He shouted while pointing at the earth crawler apes with fear painted on his face. The leader of the knights looked at his comrades. He raised his sword and stabbed it on the ground. He imbued his mana in his sword, so his mana exploded snapping up his comrades. Don't be afraid, we're the proud knights of... The leader of the knights shouted and he pulled out his sword before he charged towards the ape. The rest of the knights also charged towards the apes. All of them gathered their mana in their weapons to make it more lethal. The earth crawler ape opened its mouth and it gathered its beast energy before it roared loudly towards the group of knights. The roar dispersed all the mana that the knights gathered. The roar had beast energy in it, so when the roar clashed with the mana they gathered, the mana got scattered. Since we're weaker than that monster, Don't use any mana or spell. Just use our combat arts. The leader of the knights shouted. Knights will. All of them activated their skill. Their speed and strength increased greatly when they activated their skill. The ape arrived in front of them and shot a powerful punch. Metallic body. The leader of the knights went in front of his comrades and blocked the punch using his sword. He used his combat arts to increase the defense of his body. He was pushed back 3 meters away. The sword in his hand formed a crack and he felt his hand going numb. Strong. He said before he spat a mouthful of blood. Just from one punch, he took so much damage. Surround. The rest of the knights formed a circle around the earth crawler ape. All of them used their combat arts and attacked the ape at the same time. Sword light. Double stab. Piercing wave. Several combat arts hit the body of the earth crawler ape. The ape lifted up its hand and covered its face. It let the combat arts hit its body. Suddenly, the ape swung its free arm and grabbed one of the knights. It raised the knight up in the air before it smashed it on the other knights. This one move caused the other knights to stop moving. They all looked at their comrades. The ape lifted up both of its hands above its head before it smashed the ground. The ground shook heavily and it threw the balance of the knights. The knights fell down one by one before they got swept by the arm of the ape. The other groups, who were watching the fight from the sideline, decided to step forward and took the initiative to steal the mystical light cherry. While the knights were fighting the earth crawler ape, another group of knights stepped forward to help them. I'm Greedy, a knight of Yuvan family. What family do you serve? The leader of the knights asked the other one. I'm Vince, a knight of Jiran family. Thank you for helping us. The leader of the knight of Jiran family thanked the other leader for helping him. Don't worry, we're all came from Melosa country. It's okay if you're the one who got the mystical light cherry, but no matter what happens, we wouldn't let the people from Hebre Kingdom get it. Greedy said and he dashed towards the earth crawler ape. You're right. We wouldn't let those people from Hebre Kingdom acquire the cherry. Vince said and he also charged towards the ape. Both of them was the leader of the knights in the group, so they have some skills that could injure the earth crawler ape. The two leaders, Greedy and Vince, led the group to combat the earth crawler ape. The two took the front line and fought the ape side by side. Their power and teamwork were great that they managed to injure the earth crawler ape in just a few blows. While they were fighting the ape, a group of adventurers from Hebre Kingdom went around to take the mystical light cherry. He were quite lucky. One of the adventurers with a bow behind him said with a laugh. Yes, boss. We would earn a lot of money from this cherry. His comrades nodded at his words. Their group silently went around and slowly approached the mystical light cherry. All of them were quite excited as they got closer to the cherry. When they were 20 meters away from the cherry, the boss dashed with all of his strength and in just a few seconds he arrived in front of the cherry. He quickly stretched out his hand and plucked out the fruit from the tree. I got it. He smiled while looking at the small fruit in his hand. A powerful roar echoed behind him. The earth crawler ape ignored the knights in front of it and just went to the adventurer with high speed. It caused him to quickly turn around and run as fast as possible. Stop attacking the monster and focus on getting the mystical light cherry. The two leaders of the knight shouted. Both of them saw that an adventurer stole the fruit from the tree. The knights followed the command of their leader and they quickly chased after the adventurers. While the adventurers were running, their shadows suddenly shot upwards and strangled their bodies. It's not just the adventurers, the knights and the ape also were bound by their shadows. What the hell? The boss of the adventurers shouted when his shadow bind him. He was about to use his force to break free when a figure appeared in front of him. The figure was clad in lightning and flame. It was none other than Brian. Brian arrived in front of the adventurer before he shot a punch towards the stomach of the adventurer. He then quickly took the mystical light cherry from the hand of the adventurer. Got it? Brian smiled before he turned around. Before he could run, a shadow covered him. He looked up and saw a huge boulder of rock flying toward him. He rolled sideways, barely avoiding the boulder of rock. He lifted up his head and saw the ape was running in his direction. The earth crawler ape was extremely powerful that a simple spell like Shadow Bind wasn't enough to stop it. Not good. Brian looked around and found that the adventurers already surround him. These adventurers also possessed some power as they could break free from level 5 Shadow Bind in just a few seconds. There's no other choice. Brian said as he disappeared from his position and reappeared in front of the nearest adventurer. He reached out his hand and grabbed the adventurer and threw it at the other adventurer. Brian's speed and power were greatly enhanced because of the various spells that were cast on him. Souta also cast his agility boost and strength boost on Brian. The earth crawler ape and the knights were going to stop Brian when their shadows moved upwards once again. The ape simply shrugged the shadows and broke free from it. But the knights were different, they weren't as strong as the ape, so it would take a few seconds before they could get themselves free from these shadows. The heck? Greedy said as he grabbed the shadows and tore it apart. Who's the caster? Vince looked around trying to find the caster of the Shadow Bind spell. Both of them knew that Brian wasn't the caster of this spell. Since Brian was fighting the adventurers, he couldn't cast a spell to stop them. At first, they thought that it was Brian, but now it was the second time. It was impossible for Brian to be the caster. Suddenly, the area shook. They turned their heads and saw that the earth-crawler ape was charging reddish energy in front of its mouth. The ape opened its mouth widely and a red ball of energy formed in its mouth. It spun like a razor before it expanded. The atmosphere in the surrounding area dropped as the ape charged its energy. Souta, who was about to kill the knights with Fred, stopped when he saw the ape charge the beast energy. He immediately shouted at Brian. "Get down, Brian! Duck down!" Fred also shouted at the top of his lungs. He knew what the earth-crawler ape was doing. The ape was charging the monster's unique and powerful skill, the Bistrew. Bistrew was a powerful attack skill of a monster. Only monster that formed its monster orb can use this skill. The monster will gather their beast energy or best Faram and shot it like a powerful beam. The power behind Bistrew was devastating and it could even destroy a large part of a huge city. The earth-crawler ape shot the beam towards Brian. Chapter 70, Battle for the Mystical Light Cherry, the Appearance of the Commandments. The red energy that was spinning like a razor expanded before it shot out. The red beam flew straight towards Brian. Brian turned his head when he heard Souta's and Fred's voice. He saw a red beam flying towards his direction. He placed his hand in front of him and quickly cast a spell. "Protect me, lightning barrier and burning wall." A two-layer wall appeared in front of him. It was made of lightning and flame. These were just a tier 1 spells. He knew that this level of spell wasn't enough to stop the incoming attack. Brian raised both of his fists and launched a barrage of punches on the ground within a second. He created a crater and jumped inside before he cast another defensive spell. He didn't stop by casting one spell, he cast several defensive spells at the same time to ensure his survival. All this happened within a few seconds. The adventurers around him were still looking at the beam. They didn't notice what Brian did at all as their mind was going blank from the pressure they felt. The red beam swallowed them before it exploded. The two spells that Brian cast in the surface didn't even last a second from the beam. The ground shook heavily as a mushroom of smoke and dust rose up in the sky. The trees and the rocks in the area around the explosion disintegrated. Some of the rocks were thrown in the sky and fell down with a loud sound, creating small craters in the area. Souta used his hand to cover his eyes as a gust of wind was blowing strongly. He couldn't control his mana to protect him because of the best Faram. His mana manipulation skill was just level 2, so he couldn't do complicated things with his mana like creating a barrier. The least he could do was cast a low-level spell. He couldn't properly control his mana when there's a best Faram suppressing the mana in the area around them. Arg! What a powerful attack! Fred gritted his teeth and he focused on protecting himself. He protected himself by using the defensive spell that he knew. A single low-level spell was enough to stop the powerful gust of wind. Vince and Greedy, the leaders of the knights, went to their young master and protected them. Their priority this time was to protect their young master, or else their lord would punish them. In the worst case, their lord would kill them for not having the strength to protect their young master. Lumilia, Jasmine, CL.U.S.Ter, and Yuko was scared when they saw a huge explosion. "What's happening?" Jasmine muttered as she hugged CL.U.S.Ter tightly to her chest. "I don't know, but even at this distance," Lumilia said while looking at the explosion. Their distance from the battlefield was quite far. But still, they could feel the aftershock of the battle from this distance. The battle there must be quite intense. Lumilia looked at that direction with concern in her eyes. She doesn't have any idea how Brian and Souta could handle a fight like this. "Don't worry, young miss. They will come back with the mystical light cherry," Jasmine said to Lumilia when she saw her look. "No, I'm not worried about the mystical light cherry anymore." Lumilia shook her head and said. "I'm more worried about their well-being. Fred is there and also they are your classmates." Jasmine, while thinking about something, she added, "Young miss. Can I ask what they are usually in class?" Lumilia was a little bit surprised at her question. She looked at her and asked, curious about them. "Yeah." Jasmine nodded at her. Since I'm the class rep, I know a little bit about my classmates. Brian is always in the limelight. He's always active, lively, and friendly. If I'm to say it, I think most of our classmates are already his friend." Lumilia told her what she thinks about Brian. She recalled something, so she added, "He's also doing what he wants and never care about what others say about him. He sometimes sleeps in class, so as a class rep I have to reprimand him." Then what about the other one?" Jasmine nodded and asked about Souta. "I've got to say that he's always with Brian and Alice. At first, I think that he's not an impressive individual. He's blank, always living in the shadows of Brian. But..." Lumilia paused for a moment. She clearly had hesitation about what she's going to tell. But Jasmine looked at Lamilia as she tilted her head. CL.U.S. was listening to their conversation silently in Jasmine's arms. Lamilia looked down and started to tell Jasmine what she thought about Souta. Lately, in the mini-tournament in our class, Souta shown a terrifying side of him. He usually going along with Brian, but in the tournament, he defeated everyone with his overwhelming strength. Also, the way he killed those bandits before. I think that he is the opposite of Brian. He doesn't show any remorse in taking lives. He's doing everything with rational thought, and he could plan everything calmly even when there's an unknown powerful opponent waiting for him. He also wouldn't hesitate to use those who are close to him as a tool. Lamilia recalled what happened in the tournament. She remembered what Souta said at Alice at that time. He instigated Alice to use strength to tire out Brian so that in the upcoming fights he wouldn't have any problems. That's what also he did when Brian fought Brando from Shield class. What I don't understand is why is he helping us? I can understand it if it's Brian, but Souta, I don't think he's the type to help people without any benefits. Jasmine looked at Lamilia and said, is it because we help him in clearing the dungeon? Clearing the dungeon? No, Brian and Souta can do that with their own power. They don't need our help to clear the dungeon. Lamilia said as she shook her head. The only thing I could think of is that he wants the favor of a noble like you, young miss. Jasmine said. No, I don't think that he will care about that. Lamilia shook her head. The whole area was covered in smoke and dust. This blocked everyone's vision in their surrounding. At most, they could only see 10 meters in front of them. Beyond that was nothing but dust and smoke. Cough. Cough. Souta coughed as he patted his clothes. He wrinkled his eyebrows and waved his hand. The smoke around him was blown away. Fred, are you there? Souta said while looking around him with a wary expression. Yeah, I'm here. A reply came behind Souta. Souta turned his head and looked at Fred. He opened his mouth and said, stay where you are. I'm just going to check something. Souta was about to leave when a thunderous roar echoed in the whole area once again. The roar blew the smoke and dust in the whole area. Souta and Fred saw a huge crater. It was 30 meters in diameter and 10 meters in depth. What happened to Brian? Fred asked while looking at the crater. I don't know, Souta replied. He really doesn't know if Brian survived that attack or not. Well, it all depends on Brian. At the very least, he would get the mystical light cherry along with his corpse if Brian didn't manage to survive the attack to complete his quest. Suddenly, Souta felt something behind his head. He quickly crouched down and a blade passes over his head. Souta grabbed his sword and turned around while swinging his sword at the same time. He saw the one who attacked him was the leader of the knights. He frowned and silently cast agility boost and strength boost. You're the comrade of the man who stole the cherry, right? Greedy, the leader of the knights, asked him. Souta didn't answer him, but he took a glance at Fred and found that the other knight also attacked Fred. Luckily, Fred had some skills and managed to put up with the knight. Souta kicked the ground and took a distance from the knight leader Greedy. Greedy chased after him, but Souta used stab 4 times in a row. Clang. 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 Greedy swiftly parried all of Souta's attack. His sword then emitted a blue light and he waved it towards Souta. A blue slash tore the air and it went straight to Souta. Souta gritted his teeth as his Vajra sword emitted a red light. The red slash tore the blue slash easily. It didn't stop at all as it flew straight towards the knight leader Greedy. Cross Moon was an equipment skill of a dark grade weapon. It wouldn't lose to a low-level skill like that. Greedy was shocked when he saw his attack disintegrated. He quickly regained himself, so he raised his sword and attempted to block the red slash. Fred was at a disadvantage fighting a knight leader like Vince. Their fight was one-sided. Vince was the one who's attacking while he was the one who's defending. He was just a butler of the Asvers family that known some combat arts and spells. He could only focus on blocking all the attacks of Vince. He couldn't see any opening and Vince surely wouldn't let him do what he was thinking. He wanted Souta to help him, but he saw that Souta was also fighting a knight. I could only do this, he muttered when a voice sounded in the whole area. Ah! That was close. I thought I'm gonna die. The fight stopped when they heard a loud voice. They turned their heads only to found Brian's bloody figure. Vince and Greedy were shocked when they saw that Brian was still alive. Both of them thought that he died from the bistrew of the earth crawler ape. Brian's body was full of wounds and he was covered in blood. At his hand, he was still holding the mystical light cherry. Oh! Souta and Butler. Brian exclaimed when he saw Souta and Fred. Are you okay? Fred asked. Yeah, fine. Brian nodded. You should say no, Souta interjected. Then, the earth crawler ape saw the mystical light cherry in Brian's hand, so Brian became the target once again. Brian, get out of this forest as fast as you can. Souta said as he ignored the Knight Leader and dashed towards the Earthcrawler ape. He wanted to ask how did Brian survive that attack, but he knew that it's not a time for that. He used Cross Moon as he knew that this was one of the skills that could give the Earthcrawler ape a damage. The red slash hit the body of the Earthcrawler ape. Greedy and Vince saw this, so they were going to stop Souta and let the Earthcrawler ape kill Brian. But when they were about to move, a strange voice sounded in the whole area. Souta stopped moving and also the Earthcrawler ape. Yufufu. What a fascinating scene this is. A bunch of people are trying to kill each other for a mere mystical light cherry. Oh God. What happened to the people nowadays? Have they lost your guidance? Ignore them. I don't want to waste any more of my time. Souta opened his eyes widely and his jaw almost drops when he saw the two people that appeared. His mind was thinking of a plan to get out of this place as soon as possible. Why? Why are they here in this sort of place? The commandments of the God's will. Part 3 of the series ends here. If you enjoyed it, please give us a like and subscribe so we can be motivated to make even better videos in the future.